Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we're here for my LPL week number 8 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into this because we are so close to the playoffs. This is the final full week here in the LPL. We've got a mini week coming up to end the split. At least it's already basically happening as this video is coming out. We also have, of course, a playoff primer video that's going to be coming out later this week. So 3 LPL videos in 1 week. That's going to become commonplace at the beginning of the playoffs when there are a lot of games to get through when these teams play basically every day. So I hope you guys like LPL action. We are right around the corner from figuring out who's going to be going to MSI, and I want you to let me know down in the comment section below, what teams do you think are going to be heading there? What teams do you think should be favored in the playoffs to be heading there? What teams do you think are over or underperforming their current record? Would just love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything. Of course, if you want to know mine on everything that we've talked about in the LPL up until this point, all of the 7 weeks before this, you can check out the LPL playlist up in the iCard. Not required viewing. I will be going into a lot of my thoughts and opinions in this week, obviously, but that definitely gives you context for where I'm feeling about some of these players. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and at the end of the week, I'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will also be updating my power rankings, specifically after 8 weeks of action. Again, I know this video is coming out late. I was out of town for the weekend, and so I couldn't quite record, but we are going to be getting this video out, and I have not seen any of the games from week number 9 just yet. So, no spoilers for me. I'm just going to be going over what I see here, and we'll talk about week 9, obviously, later in the week when all of those games are done. But it's time to jump into day number 1. We've got a lot of action, as per usual, to cover here in the LPL. So many series every single day. So let's kick it off with day number 1. And day 1 was a really interesting day. Kicked off with 2 playoff teams. Invictus Gaming taking on JD Gaming. And JDG is going to pick up the 2-0 win, as they absolutely should, but this was a domination of a series. This was not particularly close from Invictus. They didn't really have a lot of pressure, a lot of prio in this series. JDG, maybe not as dominant in the regular season as you might have hoped. I certainly think this team doesn't have the same kind of X factor that they had last split. I'm not saying that's just because Knight is gone, but I certainly do think that has a lot to do with it. I like Yagao, but he's just not the same kind of player in that regard, at being able to just outplay and outskill everybody that he goes up against. And I do think top lane being a little bit less stable throughout the year has definitely, raised some concerns, but for the most part, this team has generally been fine. There certainly were concerns in this series, which we will get into, but one of them was not the new rookie up on the top side. Sheer is going to get player of the series, and I think this honestly does open up some interesting questions. I think Sheer will be playing the rest of the year. I would be surprised if he wasn't. The reports in the offseason were that Flandre was essentially being brought in as a coach, as a mentor for Sheer, and he ended up playing at the beginning of the split. I'm not sure if it's because they thought he wasn't ready, or if they just thought Flandre was going to get them more wins, but for whatever reason, they've transitioned in the middle of the split over to Sheer, and I think this is a relatively good idea. He gives you more upside than someone like Flandre does, and I wouldn't have necessarily believed that, but look at the mechanical skill that he can output. You should know he's actually had a really good split. I think he's evolved his game a lot from kind of the one-dimensional play style that he had last year. I think he's become a lot more versatile as a player, but Camille, definitely kind of a pocket pick of his. He thought he could take advantage of a young, unproven top laner. That was not the case. Sheer was incredible in this series and definitely deserved the player of the series. You can also give a lot of credit to Kanavi and Yagao, who I think both were excellent. Of course, Sheer going deathless on Cassante and Renekton is very good, but Yagao going deathless on Karma and on Annie was also great. Kanavi looked really good as a carry with a lot of resources across this series, even if Sheer and Yagao were the ones kind of setting it up for him. This was just a great series from JDG. Now, if you do have a concern, it's the fact that bot lane really has not been, I don't want to say good, because they've been very good, but they've not been what you would expect from Ruler and Missing. They've not been the best bot lane in the world. They've not been a top 2 bot lane in the LPL, in my opinion, and I think that is a bit concerning. Ruler definitely got more on track as this series went on, but some of his positioning mistakes are really starting to stand out. Still really think he's going to be fine, especially when this team starts to get into big games in the playoffs. I think he's going to be just fine. I don't think it's going to be something that I'm concerned about long term. Him and Missing obviously have shown that they can compete at the highest level, like like they did last year, but it's not been the same this year in 2024 so far. We've not seen that, explosive ability. There's been some really good games from Ruler and Missing, but there's been significantly more bad games than there were last year. And just because there's still a very good bot lane doesn't mean that expectations aren't that they should be the best bot lane in the world, or at the very least contending for the best bot lane in the world, which I just don't think they are right now in terms of performance. So, JDG still with a very good win. It's hard to harp on things because they dominated, but for Invictus Gaming, they got blasted in this one, and this team is starting to remind me of the version of themselves from spring of last year, where they got off to this ridiculously hot start because their schedule was relatively easy, or at least easier than a lot of the other teams around them, and they had a lot of familiarity. They had some explosive playstyles, and specifically this team obviously had, at the start of the split, 5 of 5 players returning. Leon obviously comes in the jungle mid-split, and that's an upgrade, but things are starting to fall off as they start to play a bit more of the aggressive, very talented teams like JD Gaming. You Should Know Me's going to get dead of the series. This very much felt like a 2023 You Should Know Me series, especially game number 1, where he picks Camille, tries to abuse the tank in the early game, just isn't actually able to generate as much of a lead against a player that is equal or above him in skill level, and just ends up being super useless. The volley bear obviously didn't help in game 2 either. This was definitely not the kind of progression you wanted to see from You Should Know Me, because he's looked a lot more versatile over the course of this split. He's been playing tanks a lot more. He's been playing weak side a lot more, playing within the structure of the team, and that just wasn't what we got here in this series. It very much was kind of a shocking, back to reality moment for You Should Know Me. Hopefully this is more of the outlier rather than the norm like it was last year. I think On and Wink obviously were a little far forward, but they were also the only ones really out there trying to make plays. On the side of IG, I honestly don't think their laning was all that bad. It was everything else that ended up being a problem for them, and they got capitalized on a lot by Kanavi. And Leon and Cryan were, I guess, generally fine, but certainly not as good as their opposition in Kanavi and Yagao. I'm not going to sit here and freak out about IG. Losing to JDG isn't the worst thing in the world, but this team is not looking nearly as strong as they did 3 weeks ago. You would have hoped that they would have at least been able to stay relevant in this series, and that didn't happen. For JDG, though, this is a really nice win. 12-2, you're sitting in a good spot. You obviously want to be one of the top 2 seeds going into the playoffs. That gives you such an advantage, but top 4 is basically guaranteed, or it might even be guaranteed for them at this point, and so you're not super worried. They're going to get that extra life essentially no matter what, but JDG still has the potential to win the LPL. They just need to clean up a few things, in my opinion. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it's kind of a good one. We had a team that was kind of hot versus a team kind of not, and it did flip around here. Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on RNG. NIP has obviously been a little bit colder in recent weeks than they were at the beginning of the split. Their schedule has gotten a bit harder. RNG, though, I think has actually gotten better as the split has gone along, which is crazy to say. Last week was clearly the best they had played all year up until this point. Schedule does play into that at least a little bit, but they weren't a team that was going out and beating fringe playoff teams a couple of weeks ago, so it was nice to see them play at least a little bit more cohesive. I think LWX in particular stepping up and being a lot better than really anything he has shown in 2024 or really 2023, in my opinion. Last week was really important towards how they wanted to play the game. Unfortunately, NIP is just more talented, and they were able to kind of tap in to the things they do really well. This was another not close series. Both series on day 1 were, kind of blowouts in that regard, and player of the series was kind of difficult because of that. I'm going to give it to Shanji in the top lane for that game number 2 performance on Renekton, but if you wanted to give it to Photic, I think those were the two that I was really kind of debating between. Both Shanji and Photic I thought were really good here. We'll get to Rookie in a second, who was also great. Zhuo, I think, was also great, but this more so felt like the traditional RNG that we had gotten very used to over the beginning part of this split, where they just are not able to keep up in terms of the mechanics with a lot of the people that they're running into, with the exception of Breathe in the top lane, who is a good player, but you can't really do enough in the top lane to be able to separate yourself. And also Shanji was just better than him, and so nice to see Shanji get back on track. He was the player that was really starting to fall off for NIP. Him and Aki have been under pretty intense criticism, I would say, over the beginning part of this split, if only because the expectations for this team are so ridiculously high. Rookie's been very good in MVP, all-pro caliber mid laner, depending on, where this team ends up finishing. Photic and Zhuo have over-exceeded my expectations. They have been significantly better than I was anticipating going into the year, and so Shanji and Aki really were the only pieces that weren't stepping up for NIP, and I think especially in recent weeks, they became the scapegoat because of it. It was nice to see Shanji in particular come out and just absolutely destroy game number 2 on the Renekton. He was so clearly the best player in that game that you just got to tip your cap. This felt like a, prototypical Shanji experience where he gets to play something that can be relatively aggressive, that has really good team fighting tools, and is just able to kind of win isolated and translate that into successful team fights. It's really good stuff, and this is exactly what you want to see out of this top side, but Rookie and Photic were also great. Photic has actually been really good this split. You know, I'm not trying to sit here and say that I was like entirely wrong for hating on Photic going into the year, because he was horrible last year, and I did think he was overrated in 2022, which is why I'm so happy to be able to say right now that he is actually starting to live up to expectations in my eyes. We're seeing positioning, you know, decisions and mechanical, you know, I guess just plays coming out from him in general on champions like Jinx and Zeri that we were not seeing last year, that we haven't really seen at any point in his career. He's been given a lot more responsibility on this team, and he's actually been able to live up to it, unlike what he was last year, which was a huge detriment to an NIP team that was built through mid and jungle. So really nice to see Photic playing well. I thought Zhuo was really good 2 games of Nautilus. When you're able to engage very freely in the mid game, when you have such a gigantic lead and the enemy team doesn't really have a lot of ways to be able to stop that, like you have a Sedge and an Alistair to peel that off, but really, I mean, how successful is it going to be to peel a Nautilus when you've got a Zeri and a Nocturne blowing you up, a Renekton who's super fed blowing up your tanks anyways? And so, you know, Photic and Zhuo were actually really good, definitely the better bot lane, but again, going into a rather weak bot lane, at least in terms of what they've shown over the course of the whole year. And Rookie somehow being the last person we talk about is insane. His game 1 on Ahri was really good, set up the Jinx in a lot of great ways, really couldn't miss charms this series. He's just crazy talented. He's really gotten back on track. I think him going to an org that he wanted to play for has been huge for him. So nice win for NIP, bad loss for RNG. You know, obviously, I don't think a lot of people expected this team to make playoffs after a good week last week, but at least to show that that development was sustainable, I think would have been a positive. That was not the case here. Basically, everybody regressed towards what they had been for a lot of the middle of this split. Breathe playing fine on the top side, not winning, but not necessarily losing as hard as everybody else on the team, and then the rest of the team just completely collapsing. Done of the series is pretty easily going to go to Wei. A really awful series from him. I know people are talking about Milky Way and talking about his ability to come back to RNG because he is on loan from RNG at FPX, and that definitely seems like the direction that this team is going to move in the future, because Wei is just not it anymore. He hasn't been in about a year and a half, and this was just another example of that. Aki really out-pressured him, and Wei was horrible in some of these team fights on champions like Xin Zhao and Sejuani that you really need to be effective in those zones on, so not ideal. LWX and Ming also got run over. The bot gap in this series was pretty massive. This felt like a return to form for LWX, who was really good last week, but really, really, really awful for most of the rest of the split, or pretty much all of the rest of the split. He still is one of the lowest graded out players over the course of this split in my program, and so, you know, I'm not surprised to see him 2 games of Smolder not really have any sort of influence. Ming has been awful. One of the bottom 3-ish supports in the LPL in terms of performance. Not ideal. Tong Yuan got run over by Rookie. That's not a huge surprise, but again, it reiterates that Tong Yuan is just not good enough to play at this level. And like I said, Breathe was fine, but RNG, this more so felt like what we were expecting from them. They're still not going to be a playoff team. Maybe they're not as bad as we once assumed, like a bottom 3 team or anything like that, but this team is still not particularly good. And then for NIP, really necessary win. You just got to get some confidence to get back on track to where you were at the beginning of the split. There was a time where this team was fighting for top 3, top 4. That's kind of fallen to the wayside, but at 9-4, there's still an interesting middle playoff team that I think could make a run if everything goes right. Then moving on now to day number 2, our second day kicks us off with a really interesting upset, if you will. LGD Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, and LGD is going to pick up a 2-1 series win here, and this is consequential. Weibo is really trying to make playoffs right now, and they're not exactly in the best of positions. They're not in the worst of positions, because there are a lot of teams near the bottom that are underperforming in terms of the playoffs right now, and so losing this doesn't eliminate them or anything, but moving to 6-10, or 6-8, I should say, and not necessarily being in that great of a spot moving into the final couple of weeks is certainly concerning, especially with teams like LNG doing better as of late. You know, we're talking about teams like AL also underperforming, but, you know, Weibo needs to step up. They're not in a great position to guarantee themselves a playoff spot if they can't earn it towards the back half of these weeks, but nice win for LGD again. This has been a team that has overperformed my expectations basically all year. Dropped them down to number 14 because it felt like there were other teams in that cluster that were actually more interesting in terms of upside, but LGD has always stayed tough. Basically in every series that they have played, they have stayed relatively tough. 11-22 honestly doesn't give a good indicator of how good this team has been. They've not been a playoff team, but they've been the best of like the bad teams pretty clearly. Of the non-playoff teams, they've honestly been the most consistent, which I think is pretty crazy to say, and this was a good series. Kepler, first of all, was back in the AD carry spot. Doesn't matter too much. I actually think Xiaoya has been relatively fine for this team. And Kepler was really bad for them at the beginning of the year. He was really bad in the LDL last year as well. But, you know, if you want to put him in for the perceived upside because he's played at the LPL level before, I understand. He wasn't a huge factor in this series. It was mostly the top side, in my opinion. Haichao and Meteor mid-jungle duo finally stepping in, finally making some important plays happen. Haichao has been great all split long, and he's going to get player of the series here because of the way that, honestly, he just kind of gapped Xiaohu in the isolated 1v1. I know Xiaohu's never been known for his laning at a super high level. He's not this, like, dominant laning player, but Haichao, I think, really, you know, showed something in this series, and he's been a lot better than expectation, at least for me, across this entire year. He's been the best player on LGD. He's consistently winning lane. He's consistently being useful in the mid game for a player who's been in the league for so long and not really made this gigantic impact. You know, it's really nice to see him have kind of a breakout year so far in 2024. Hopefully he can keep that up. I know the potential and the promise has always been there. People have chalked it up to bad teammates around him. Maybe that was the case. I was thinking that if he was going to break out, it was probably going to be last year with a couple of other players on this roster that I thought were relatively good, but no, with a less talented roster around him this year, he's actually doing a little bit better. Maybe the bigger resource pool for him to get is helping, but Meteor was incredibly important. He ended up actively winning game number 3 with that Poppy in the back half. If you don't end up, you know, making the plays that he made, I don't know if LGD actually wins that third and final game. It was that close, and so it's really nice to see Meteor getting back on track. I've been very critical of his 2024. People were lauding over this guy in 2023, but when you go back and look at some of those performances, and the reason I was lower on him than a lot of other analysts going into 2024 was that he had to get his signature champions in order to do it. You had to get the Graves, you had to get the Kindred, you had to get these marksman aggressive carries in the jungle for him to pop off in the way that, you know, you were getting the same kind of performances out of Xiao Hao on different junglers, like in the same kind of sphere of bad team, good jungler. I think Meteor's a good player, and certainly he's been somebody who's excelled at this level in the past, but, you know, it's taken him a while to get going this year, and he's been a bit of a weak point for this team. It's nice to see he can still have a team fight impact on something that wouldn't necessarily be considered a champion in his, you know, small pool, if you will. Kepler and Jinzhao were fine. Kepler looked good. He was able to capitalize on a lot of the things the rest of the team was able to create. Bertle was definitely the better top laner, but mid-jungle to me was definitely the standout. I think Haichao was great, and Meteor was really good, even if his scoreline doesn't show it across this series. And for Weibo, this is a bad loss. Again, 6 and 8 is not where you want to be. This team wants to make playoffs. They made World Finals last year. This was a top 2 team in the world, at least at that tournament last year, and now they're sitting here and they might not even make playoffs going into the spring split. It's an absolute disaster, but dud of the series is going to go to ZDZ in the top lane. He's just not been good enough. This was an aggressive series from ZDZ where he was consistently looking for challenges and was consistently punished for it by Meteor, and that's really bad. Like, this was the Shy performance. The Shy? This was a version of the Shy, just without the mechanics, and that's really not what you're bringing ZDZ in for. In my opinion, the reason you're bringing him in, first of all, is obviously the synergy he has with Xiao Hao from the many years on AL, but for the stability, that's kind of always been his thing. He's kind of been cube light, if you will, in terms of how he plays the game. He's a stable weak side top laner, and that obviously deteriorated a bit last year, and he wasn't very good for AL last year. He's been even worse, or maybe just as bad for Weibo. This year, it's been pretty equal in my opinion, but, you know, it's not like the Shy was killing it in the regular season either. I think you just have so much less upside on the top side of the map. Even if I do like Xiao Hao, and even if I do think Xiao Hao played well in this series, I thought the Lee Sin game in Game 2 was really good, and even if he misplayed a lot of the fights in the back half on the Maokai, something that he's clearly just not as comfortable on, the Lee Sin was solid, and I can't really sit here and yell or complain about that. Light and Crisp were fine. They generally weren't the problem. Xiaohu, though, getting outplayed in the mid lane by Haichao, certainly not what you want to see from somebody who just made World Finals, from a future Hall of Famer. It's just not ideal. Weibo is clearly just missing something right now. These players are not playing up to their level. There's mechanical mistakes. There's mental mistakes. It's just not working. Even if this team does make the playoffs, are they going to be able to do anything in it? I know they have the reputation of beating teams that are better than them, but, you know, this team has not felt like world beaters really at any point, and they're in danger of missing the playoffs because of it. But for LGD, nice win. I don't think it changes anything. You're still pretty far out of the playoffs, and it would take a miracle to end up getting in there. I think it's possible, but I don't think it's very likely. It might not even be possible, but still, this team has overperformed a lot, and a lot of these young players have shown reasons to continue on with them in the future. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, and it's another upset, a team that should be better than what they showed here. Team WE taking on ThunderTalk Gaming, and ThunderTalk does pick up the 2-0 series win. Game 1 was pretty back and forth. There were opportunities for WE to be able to win it through their Fed Kai'Sa, but it just wasn't enough. And then Game 2 was an absolute slaughter. They were able to play through the bot lane, they were able to play through Nico engages and just kind of end the game very, very quickly. This was very clinical from ThunderTalk, and honestly, they have been significantly better in recent weeks. If this team had been better at the beginning of the season, if Beishuan and Hoya hadn't been two of the single worst players in the LPL for most of this year, I actually do think that this is a super interesting outcome because at 6-8, they have the same record as Weibo Gaming in terms of series score, and so playoffs are definitely still in play for ThunderTalk. The inconsistency at the beginning of the year with Beishuan and Hoya being some of the worst players in the LPL, it's just been a little bit better, I would say, recently, and 1xN in particular has also stepped up, and so you're happy to see that. But the players who have always been there, the rocks across this split in UCal in particular, but also Chocho, I think we're also good here. 1xN is going to get player of the series because I do think the bot lane gap in Game 2 was the bigger story, was the bigger takeaway for me from this series. 1xN looked great on Lucian, and it's not something that everybody has looked great on. That is absolutely for sure, and so to see him come out and actually have a good series across the board, his Smolder game in Game 1 was also very good. He was the centralizing force in the back half of those team fights when the Kai'Sa was also strong. You know, it's just impressive stuff. You're really hoping he can keep that up, and, you know, for this bot lane to actually turn into something a little bit more cohesive rather than Chocho being a playmaker for the mid lane and 1xN just kind of being on an island down in the bot lane. That's kind of what you would hope, that this 2v2 becomes a little bit stronger. Chocho continues to look really good. I really like Chocho. I think he's had a very good split here for ThunderTalk, and I would expect it to continue. He was just straight up better than Awandi in this series, whether it was in lane or out of lane. As a roamer, we'll get to Awandi, who I think is kind of going under the radar for playing really bad right now for WE, but UCal was obviously fantastic in that same vein. The Nico in particular in that second game was really dominant in terms of the ultimates he was able to hit, and the team fights that he was essentially able to win on his own. UCal has been great all split long. This is not a surprise. Beishuan and Hoya were also solid, but for a team effort for ThunderTalk, for them to just be able to outskill and outplay WE basically across the board, a team that at one point in time was pretty clearly a top 4 team in my eyes in terms of how they had been performing, to push them to 500, to continue their losing streak. It's certainly not good for WE, but this is a big win for ThunderTalk to keep their playoff hopes alive. Again, they are not eliminated by any means. They can certainly still make a run if everything ends up going right. So we'll end up seeing how the rest of their split ends up playing out. But for WE, you know, just a really bad performance across the board. It's really hard to look at how anyone played in this series and think positively. Prince was okay in Game 1 in terms of trying to keep the game alive, but a lot of those chances were kind of handed to him. He didn't necessarily do anything major for them, and it's not like anybody else was winning. Wayward, I guess, was generally fine, but didn't get nearly as many resources as he's become accustomed to. And, you know, as we've seen over the past couple of series, maybe he hasn't been quite as dominant when he's not getting the same amount of attention from the rest of his team, but it was everybody else that let him down in game number 2. What an awful game 2 across the board. Hang was miserable in game 1 and was a little bit better, I guess, in game 2, but like 0-7 on Xinjiao in game 1. He very narrowly got done of the series here. I'm going to give it to Prince. I think you could give this to Awandi. It's really how you want to look at the situation. Prince in game 2 was definitely the least valuable member of WE. He was the one keeping them alive in game 1, but was certainly the least valuable in game 2. But how much do you put on that? On him as a player in that circumstance, because he was 1v2ing basically the entire laning phase. Awandi was just kind of roaming around on the Bard, not really doing anything, not making any plays, not affecting any other lanes. You know, I don't really know what Awandi was doing. It was just kind of a horrible game 2 from him. And I think this just goes to say what I've been saying all split long. I like Prince as a player. I'm starting to sour a bit on some of his mechanics, although I do think they're still better than people are giving him credit for, especially Reddit, who has just chosen to hate him because anybody who goes to NA as an import is immediately like the most hated player in the entire world. It's just kind of how it goes. But like, I think Prince has been generally fine. He's been about average in terms of his mechanics. His opportunity has been some of the lowest in the entire league. First of all, this team does prioritize a lot of attention in the top lane, but second off, Awandi is just gone. Like, the guy doesn't play laning phase anymore, and, you know, that worked for someone like Stay because he was so consistent in terms of his survivability, and he was a great mid-game skirmisher. He wanted to fight a lot early, but that's just not who Prince is. He's a lot more slow in terms of how he is played here in the LPL, and I think that this style, you know, these two players in particular just do not mesh well together. Even if Stay isn't the better player in terms of mechanics out of him and Prince, which I do think it's debatable. I don't think it's necessarily always Prince or anything like that. I think Stay is a good player, and I think Prince could be a good player in the right circumstance. it is clear to me that Prince and Awandi are just not going to work as a duo. These two do not have any chemistry, they do not have any synergy, and Awandi and Stay did have a lot of chemistry and synergy, so I'm shocked to see Stay not be in the lineup here. I like Prince as much as the next guy, but it just feels like the right time to make a roster decision because you're going into playoffs. This is a team that should be a top 4, top 5 team in terms of the performances they gave in the middle of the split, even against good teams, but here you are losing to Thunder Talk and not looking nearly as good. It is concerning, and Fofo, I think, has taken a step back, and, Hang has been bad for most of the split. He's been the weak link for most of this split. Wayward, I think, hasn't necessarily dominated like he was for most of this split. There are real concerns that this team is colder than they've been at any point this year going into playoffs, which is certainly something that you don't want to hear. But for Thunder Talk, nice win. Everybody played well, and again, your playoff hopes are still alive. This was a win to keep you in the running, even if it will still take a lot to get you into the playoffs. And then moving on now to day number 3, and our third day of the week is certainly an intriguing one because we kick off with such an important matchup between LNG Esports and Anyone's Legend that LNG is going to win. This is an incredibly crucial series for both of these teams to actually perform and step up in because both of them are on the brink of the playoffs. 6-7 for LNG, 7-7 for AL going into this series. Losing this puts you in a significantly worse position. Obviously, you've got teams like Weibo and Thunder Talk on your heels trying to catch up, trying to push their way into the playoffs, and AL has fallen into a significantly worse spot. Because of that, they are incredibly cold right now. They are playing the worst league they have all year, and I really do not trust this team, but LNG does look a lot better, and what a shock. I guess we can get into this now. A lot of the conversation has been around LNG moving on to a different strategic coach and about how that was holding them back and about how the coaching staff was not necessarily putting them in the best position to succeed. And while I agree with that, I certainly don't think that changing out your strategic coach has hurt this team. Look at the win streak. I don't think you can sit here and say that is the causation. Right? I think that's bad analysis, and in my opinion, it's circumstantial analysis. I think that there is a lot to this story. As I've talked about on this channel a lot, we expected this win streak. We expected them to go on this giant win streak after really struggling at the beginning of the split. I've said as much basically every single week in these weekly recaps that they were going to start getting hot towards the end of the split. Well, why? Why did I know that? Am I a prophet? No, their schedule got significantly easier. All of their difficult games were at the beginning of the split. They basically exclusively played bottom tier teams over the past 3 weeks. And so yes, this win streak is really encouraging, and it does show that this team is better than a lot of the bottom teams, but we knew this was going to happen. They've basically beaten the teams that they were supposed to beat and lost to the teams they were supposed to lose to, and that's fine for LNG. It certainly doesn't change my opinion, and, Weiwei, I think, is still someone that I'm going to need to see perform in the playoffs, but a lot of people, I've seen this take actually be really common online. A lot of people have said, oh, people were blaming Weiwei and Tarzan's departure for why this team was struggling and, why they weren't playing nearly as well when it was clearly just the coaching staff because of this win, and they point to this win streak, right? I still subscribe to the idea that when this team goes up against, playoff top 6-ish teams, they're not going to be as consistent. I think the differences in playstyle between Weiwei and Scout are still going to be something that they're going to have to take note of. And so, again, while I think this team is definitely better than they were at the beginning of the split, if only because Hong has come in and I think really increased the floor of this team, I do think that it's not perfect. Beating AL doesn't convince me that they can go and beat top esports, right? It's not the same thing in my eyes. So would love to know your thoughts on whether you agree or disagree with that down below. But talking about this series in particular, they were definitely better in game 1, and game 2 was still really good for them. Hong is a very clear player of the series. This team has gotten infinitely better since reinserting him into the support position. Nothing against Mark. I think he's fine. He's a generally league average support, can be really aggressive, is going to give you positives, is going to give you negatives, but Hong is an above average, a top 3, top 4 support in the LPL. He is, borderline top 5 support in the world, somewhere around that category, and re-putting him back into this lineup with Gala, allowing him to be a big playmaker for this team. He's doing a lot of the things that you brought Mark in to do, except he's doing them a lot more consistently. He was awesome in this series, definitely made Hope's life a living hell, which we will talk about, but was just a nuisance in every single team fight. Really great series from him. Gala, I think, has also looked significantly better ever since Hong came back in. He was looking not nearly as consistent as his career averages, and, Gala's never really played with a bad support ever since he came over to RNG. Obviously, you go back to his early days in the LPL, he played with plenty, but Hong, I think, is definitely somebody that is going to make Gala better, and Gala just needs kind of that push. He's so good with resources. He's so good when he's given the opportunity by his team. He's not always going to be given that opportunity, but he looked good here. Weiwei was good. Zika was really solid. Scout was fine in the mid lane. Better on the Karma than on the Jace, in my opinion, but, you know, I think LNG just looked really good in this series. Game 2 was definitely a little bit more in the air in terms of when it would end, but they had control of this series all the way through. And AL, to their credit, looks awful. Like, this team just doesn't have a lot going for them right now. A lot of mechanical misplays, especially in important back half of the game situations. They're very cold. It doesn't feel like they're able to compete with top tier teams. Whatever magic got them to 7-4 to start this split, it's gone now. 7-8, 4-series loss streak. It's just not looking good for them. And they're, again, in danger of missing the playoffs because of this loss. They have a difficult ending of the year schedule. And so you really got to see them win games that are, you know, teams around their skill level. Hope is going to get done to the series, but I think you could give this to, honestly, like anybody. Like, Kale wasn't particularly great. I think Hope was the one who was taken advantage of a bit more, specifically in game 1 on the Callista, where things just did not go his way. Shanks' scoreline actually looks pretty good in this game. 9, 6, and 7. You're like, all right, you know, that's not bad for this series. 2 games of Ahri, but go watch some of these fights. He's missing charms. He's not dealing damage. His positioning is really bad. This is an atypical Shanks performance. He was awesome at the beginning of the split for this team, and he was really not good here. Harry has just not been good. I am out on Harry. I've talked about that all split long. I was low on him last year, but I conceded that there was a ton of mechanical upside if he could transition his game to be more complete. It's just not happened. The mechanical, you know, prowess has gone down. His laning stats have gone down, and the team fighting is just as bad as it was last year. And so you're looking at him as a detriment to this team in the top lane. And somehow, someway, Krako was the best player. He's been very inconsistent for this team. It's been really bad over the past month or so. But, you know, look back to the first month, and he was actually really good when this team was winning. He's just a very volatile player. He's going to have good games. He's going to have bad games. Ironically enough, I do compare him to someone like Willer over in the LCK. I think their play styles are pretty similar, but, you know, Krako was trying to make plays happen, and it's just not enough from the rest of the team. He certainly still made mistakes, but, you know, it wasn't enough. His play style was definitely keeping them in this series. But for LNG, I should say big win. AL, big loss. This is really kind of consequential for both of these teams. LNG is now sitting at 7-7. Obviously, it doesn't guarantee them playoffs or anything. They still need to be able to complete the rest of this split, but this puts them in a much better position to get there like they wanted to be this whole time. And then for AL, if they keep playing the way that they have over the last couple of weeks, they're doomed. They're not going to make playoffs, and that would be a disaster. This organization spent a lot of resources to try to get into the playoffs this year for the first time since converting over from Rogue Warriors, and unfortunately right now, it just doesn't seem like it's happening. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, and a series that was closer than I expected it to be considering the two teams. OMG taking on Bilibili Gaming, and Bilibili is going to pick up the win here in 3. You would have maybe expected BLG to kind of dominate this one. They've only lost 4 games all year long leading up until this point, and so OMG didn't necessarily feel like the team that was going to kind of push them in this kind of way, but they did. They had a pretty good game number 2. They were able to play off their super fed Jinx, and they ended up dominating the early game. But outside of that, it really was Bilibili able to control a lot of this series, able to be the better team, especially with the substitutes on OMG, or at least the main substitute in the mid lane. And I think for me, I'm still pointing a lot of that in favor of Knight. And I know people are tired of me talking super highly about Knight in these videos. I know I get pushback every time I rank him as the best player in the LPL, but I just can't see it any other way at this point, especially with Ruler struggling. He was the other player that I think you could realistically consider as the best player in the LPL going into the year. And to me, Knight has clearly been better than Ruler in 2024. And look at the impact of the two teams. Not to say that regular season is everything. We're definitely going to see what happens when we get into the playoffs. But, you know, Knight and Yagao swap teams, and Bilibili becomes the best team in the league, and JD Gaming doesn't have the same kind of firepower. It's not 1-1 because 369 did also leave JDG, and you've got a less experienced topside than you had before. But, like, Knight's been the best player in the league, at least so far this split, in my opinion, and he's definitely a favorite with Bilibili being the best team to be the MVP. And yeah, did he get caught out a little bit too much sometimes, especially in the early game on the Talia or even on the Karma when he really didn't need to? Yeah, sometimes he just turns his brain off for some of these plays because he is so talented, but his mid game is better than anybody else in the world right now, and it's not like he ever loses a team fight. And even when he does get caught, he's still up 40 CS having been in lane for 2 minutes less. It's ridiculous how good he is and how much better he is than a lot of the people he's playing into. Again, he was playing into a sub in the mid lane in this series, so I'm not going to try to overanalyze the situation, but he did look fantastic. I think Elkanon also looked great, with the exception of game 2. Again, we're seeing it pretty regularly now that Smolder is just kind of losing in the LPL. I'm not saying that that's going to be a trend, but this was a champion that looked unbeatable or dominant or destructive in its first week allowed in the LPL, and now teams are realizing, oh, if we just pick either something that scales into it like the Jinx, or something that can just get on top of it and disrupt it like a Lee Sin or like a Nico, it all of a sudden becomes a lot easier to actually play against it. It's not necessarily as unbeatable as you would think it would be. I don't think it's won a game yet this week so far, so that's good, but Lucian and Kai'Sa from Elk both looked really good, specifically the Kai'Sa in game number 3, where he was super influential towards the outcome of that game. On was really solid. Love him on Rakan. It's just unfair to be able to give him a champion that he is this good on consistently. He's more well known for things like the Blitzcrank, in my opinion, than Nautilus, but the Rakan is still up there as one of his best playmaking champions, as a big playmaker in the support position. Jun and Bin were both fine, but Elk, Knight, On, they were definitely the standouts for me when it came to BLG in this series. And for OMG, like we talked about, a couple of substitutions. First of all, Abel played game 1 and then was subbed out for game number 2. Starry came in. Abel has been a disaster for this team this year. Him and PP God have both not been particularly good for OMG, and that is definitely concerning, but they go to Starry, who was also really bad at the start of this split when he was given an opportunity over Abel in game number 2, and he looks great on the Jinx. He's able to get kind of hyper scaled into the late game, and he's just doing more damage than something like Smolder can do from low resources on the other side, and he's actively able to win that game for OMG, which is huge, but not enough to be able to carry them on the Zeri in game 3. Thank God Yuumi lost. I hate Yuumi so much. I hate that it's in the meta here. Also worth noting, Angel is out, at least for the foreseeable future. Linfang is in. I don't know how long this is going to last, but Angel had family dilemma come up. His father passed away, and so he's taking some time off. I presume he will be back for the playoffs, but presumably he's going to miss the final week of the regular season as well. So definitely not ideal for OMG, who's trying to get the best seed possible, and Angel is their best player, but Linfang, he's going to have to step in. Unfortunately, couldn't quite in this series. He's going to get done to the series. It did feel like a pretty massive mid-gap, in my opinion, between Knight and Linfang. I don't think he played awful. He certainly could have played worse for somebody kind of thrust into a position he probably shouldn't be in, but it was fine. Xiao Feng, I think, had one of his worst series in a while. He was actually given some resources in some of these games and didn't really get to do anything with them. He couldn't really translate any of the resources he was able to get into anything substantial. I think he actually played kind of bad in game number 3, and then Cube was whatever on the top side. I do credit Starry for playing well in game 2 on the Jinx, and, I think that if Abel's going to play bad, and if you trust Starry to come in and actually be better, then maybe try him out towards the end of the regular season, see what you might want to do going into playoffs, but, if this bot lane is a problem, or if this, mid lane is going to be a problem for the rest of the regular season, top side's been a problem, this is still not going to be an elite team. It's really hard to get a read on OMG because they're not particularly talented, and they're not playing well, but they continue to win games because of players like Angel and Xiao Feng, so without them, it's probably not going to go well. But for Bilibili, great team, best team in the league, maybe best team in the world. Everything I've said about them in previous weeks applies here. Knight is playing phenomenal. He is probably the favorite for MVP, at least for a lot of people right now. Bilibili being the best team, him being the most impactful member of the team. He's been amazing, but Elkanon looked great in this series, and it really does feel complete every single time this team plays. Then moving on now to day number 4, our middle day here in the LPL, and typically speaking, this would be the start of our super days. That's kind of how the LPL has gone. In 2024, every single one of these days has been expanded because there are less weeks than there were, 3 years ago or so, and so we've got super days all the time, but not this week. We actually have a regular 2-series day here on day 4. Super days start on day 5. So, starting off with day 4 here, we've got a matchup of maybe the 2 worst teams in the LPL, Ultra Prime taking on Edward Gaming. And EDG picks up a win here. It's not entirely consequential because, they're way out of the playoffs. Both of these teams are way out of the playoffs. In fact, I think they were the only 2 that were confirmed not in the playoffs going into this week, but it's still good to see, some development, some changes, some positivity coming out from EDG. They make a change in the mid lane. Fisher is out. Fisher has been a disaster for EDG. He's been hyped up for so long as this T1 product that they spent a lot of resources to go and get and bring into their system. They have been letting him play in the LDL for forever, and he's never really taken that next step. They finally gave him the opportunity here in the LPL, and he was one of the worst mid laners in the entire region, which is not particularly good. And so he is out. 0909, let me know down in the comments, Is that how you say it? I really don't know. Genuinely, I have no idea how I'm supposed to say it. I'm going to say 0909. It might be, leet for something. Like, there might be, YSKM as you should know me, and I didn't know that until week number 3 or whatever last year. So, if there's a pronunciation to this that I'm just not getting, please let me know down in the comment section below. But he's going to be coming in the mid lane, and honestly, he was significantly better than anything Fisher was offering. Not the toughest of competition, and Uakai, I think, still did some good things throughout this series, but, EDG was just generally better, and a lot of that came from the top side, in my opinion. Player of the series is, of course, going to go to Ale. How can EDG win a series and it not be off the back of Ale? He certainly is the most consistent player that this team has. He's actually been pretty good this year, and I think he's shown a lot of traits that let me believe that if you traded him to a top-tier team, if a good team actually went out and got him, he could still be an all-pro caliber top laner. He could be somebody that's consistently winning you games, one of the best in the entire region, one of the best in the entire world. He's not necessarily gotten that opportunity to prove that over the course of this year for obvious reasons. This team is a disaster with a bunch of rookies, but when they win, it's often because of him, and he has clearly, in my opinion, been the best player on EDG throughout this year. But Monkey, credit to him, he was also really good in this series. The Xin, the Viego, the Graves, all 3 games were actually pretty solid. Maybe not so much the game 1 on Xin, but the Viego and the Graves, he looked really good. He was able to take over that second game on Viego and really start to snowball out of control in some of those team fights. Big credit to him. He's actually kind of struggled a bit in the middle of this split. He came in the first 2 games. It was like, oh, okay, they have something here. Jeje's injured, and so Monkey coming in to replace him, maybe they can get something out of this young group now that they're not winning games, now that they don't feel pressured to go out there and win games. But he really trailed off. It's nice to see that against, a bad team, he can still step up and actually show some of the good traits that this team sees in him. Like I said, mid lane was definitely better for EDG. 0909 was definitely solid. He didn't really get to play a lot of carry champions. He wasn't necessarily ever considered a focal point of this team, but just surviving is better than anything that EDG has had in that role all year long. The Snake and Vampire are fine. I'm kind of becoming a fan of the Snake, even if he wasn't particularly good in this series, and Vampire's still bad. Bot lane was definitely kind of the weak link, if you will, of EDG, but Ale, Monkey, definitely strong enough to be able to push them over the top. And then for Ultra Prime, unfortunately, we've gone full circle. We've gone from preseason, oh, this is clearly the worst team in the league, to, they're doing better than expected, to, oh, actually, they're staying competitive in a lot of these series, and a lot of the other teams like EDG and Rare Atom and RNG are really underperforming, to now back to, oh, they're the worst team in the league, pretty clearly. It's pretty funny how, life circles like that, but they just have not been able to keep up their pressure. They were okay, I guess, theoretically in this series, but certainly not perfect. Dway is going to get dud of the series for me. I think he had his worst game of the year in Game 2. Truly miserable on the Renata. He played about as bad as you can play on that champion, not having impactful ults, really, really bad positioning in the mid-game, constantly getting caught out. It really does feel like he has just struggled to fit into this team dynamic of not winning. He's been on winning teams, winning organizations in BLG for a little while. Obviously not for the main team, but for the LDL team. I don't think he's used to playing with such bad players around him, and I don't think he's used to playing without pressure, which I think has become clear, but he kind of reminds me a lot of how someone like Zoelise is playing over in the LEC right now. I think it's pretty similar. Interesting players, but really bad circumstances. Uakai and Doggo were fine. Hacker was okay in Game 1, but outside of that, there's really not a lot of positives to talk about. Decade is not very good. He can't really go up against Ale, even if he wasn't the problem. Hacker definitely deteriorated down the stretch of this series when he's not able to get his early leads that he is actually able to get relatively consistently. When he's not able to get them, he's pretty bad, and Uakai definitely doesn't do nearly as much as his scorelines would indicate. Ultra Prime is just kind of a bad, boring team, and that's kind of where they've settled in, being the worst team in the league. Losing to EDG kind of confirms and solidifies that they have the worst record, and they just lost to the second worst team in the league, and so expect them to fall down to that in the standings. But for EDG, nice win. Again, it doesn't matter. You're just kind of looking for upside. You're looking for something to cling on to in terms of positivity after this disaster of a start to the spring split. You're not going to be making playoffs. You're not going to be more relevant because of this, but at least this team can win if given the right circumstances. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and it's a good one. It's another kind of proving match for one of these teams. It's Rare Atom taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and for the second time this week, NIP is going to pick up a win, and this time it's a 2-0-1, and they look really, really good, and you just have to be excited for this team. I know that there were concerns because they kind of had the opposite LNG kind of thing where they played a lot of the easy teams early, they played a lot of the harder teams late. Obviously, that's not going to stop in week number 9 or at the end of week 8 and in week number 9 when they play arguably the 2 toughest teams in the entire league to close out their split. But at 10-4, they're in a really good spot, and honestly, I think this team does have top 4 upside in terms of what they could accomplish if they can continue to be this consistent. So much to like about the performance they put in here. Player of the series for me is going to go to Fodic, and Fodic honestly was really good this week, and he honestly has been really good across this whole split. Like, I didn't really expect to say that. Obviously, I talked about this earlier in the week. I've always been a lot lower on Fodic. I've always been kind of the negative, dissenting opinion on him as like a top 5 ADC in the LPL. I know he was getting that kind of hype after his Victory 5 year in 2022. I was never on that train. There were just too many good ADCs in the LPL for me to put him in the same category as them, but this is the best split of his career, and I firmly believe that in terms of individual performances, in terms of showing off the mechanical talent that everybody was always talking about him having. You know, this is it. In a lot of the other years, he had been a player that had really done a good job of capitalizing on the resources others were gaining for him, but now he's getting them himself, and he's able to carry games on his own. It's really impressive stuff, like top tier AD carry stuff. You know, he's been the centralizing point of this team alongside Rookie, and I think it's made them good. Obviously, it wasn't just them. Aki had a really good series here, maybe one of his best in an NIP uniform. He really is not capitalized on his big breakout year in 2023. I'm not entirely shocked to see him kind of regress back to the norm. I think I'm definitely more surprised about Shanji in the top lane, but, you know, he also had a good series. We'll get to that. But Aki, I think, has been somebody that, you know, he was okay for OMG for a long time, a good jungler and somebody with, you know, very good upside, but maybe not great upside. And then he had this giant year last year where he was one of the best junglers in the LPL, almost was, you know, like pushing his team into Worlds, right? In spring, he was top 3. In summer, he was like top 4 in terms of LPL junglers. It was really impressive, the performances he was able to put out, but it really was kind of a breakout year in terms of the expectations weren't there for him to be the star of that OMG team. This year feels a lot more akin to what we've kind of come to expect from a player like Aki, but these are still the performances you're going to get from a very good jungler, maybe just not an elite level jungler. Shanji was very good, got a lot of resources in this series. I think that's something that NIP have, you know, done a lot this year. Is obviously Aki's invested a lot into Shanji, and Rookie, I think, as a roamer on Talia, has invested a lot into Shanji. I think Fodic might deserve a few more of those resources at this point with the amount of leads he's able to generate on his own, but it allows Shanji to stay in this game, and he was definitely the better top laner. I think Rookie was good. I think Zhuo was fine. His scoreline's definitely better than some of the engages he ended up having, but it certainly wasn't a massive problem, especially because it did end up netting his hyper carry some gold, and so you feel good for NIP. Again, they're better than most teams in the league. Are they going to be elite? Are they going to guarantee be a top 3, top 4 team? You know, no. I think it's pretty open. Top 4 is certainly open for almost anybody to be able to take if things continue to go right for them, but NIP is definitely going to be one of the teams that's going to be interesting in that regard. And then for RA, you know, they're just not great. They fluctuate between being kind of interesting and not very interesting very frequently. This was not a very interesting series from them. Xiaoshu is going to get dud of the series here. You know, I like Xiaoshu. I've been very high on him. I think that he is somebody who, obviously, I give Rookie of the Year to last year, Rookie of the Split in summer, and the upside was clear. His ability to generate his own leads was massive. He just needed to get a lot more consistent throughout the entirety of the game. Hasn't always been there for RA. He's had some bad games here or there, but for the most part, still actually been okay, and still has shown some of the upside throughout this year, but this series was just straight up bad. Shanji got a lot of resources from NIP, and honestly, RA and Xiaoshu in particular just couldn't quite keep up. They weren't able to survive that, which is definitely unfortunate. Neyu definitely got out-jungled as well. Whether you want to give it to Xiaoshu or Neyu, I think both kind of deserve it, and both definitely could make a pretty heavy case that they were the worst players in this series. Again, Neyu's been one of my biggest disappointments of the year. I was really high on him going into the year. I was really kind of expecting him to be one of the big breakout junglers in terms of the rookies, but he was not the rookie jungler to break out, and that's definitely kind of disappointing after how good he was in the LDL, how good his tape was. I mean, how translatable it felt like a lot of the skills that he had were. It's not working. His early game is bad, and he's not really able to survive. Zora and Assume are just whatever, one of the weaker bot lanes in the LPL, if only because neither of them are particularly outstanding at anything. They're both just kind of there. And Vikla was honestly pretty good here, but only so much you can do on the Karma in game 2 once the rest of your team has already fallen almost entirely out of control. So, you know, for RA, they're just kind of a meh team. They're certainly better than what they were at the beginning of the year when it felt like they couldn't win a game to save their lives. Like, they're at 9-22, or 9-24, I guess now, 4-10. Like, you can live with that after that start, but I definitely think Rare Adam's either going to be making changes or just expecting a better result come summer. But for NIP, again, really nice win. You put yourself in a pretty decent position. You know, top 4, top 5 is pretty open for anybody to take. Top 3 feels pretty locked at this point, but you can really get in a lot of good spots if you continue to win here. I know their schedule's been kind of interesting in terms of the way that it's been formatted, but they've done everything that they're supposed to get to this spot. Then moving on now to day number 5, and this is actually the start of our super days. Of course, final 3 days are all super when it comes to the LPL, and kicking us off an upset, but kind of a predictable one in terms of just how funny the storyline is between these two teams. It's FunPlus Phoenix taking on RNG, and of course RNG won it. Like, why are we even surprised by this at all? We've got a jungler for FPX that is on loan from RNG. Obviously on RNG, you have the former bot laner for FPX that won Worlds on that team, and so you got a lot of storylines. You got a lot of things going on in this one, and RNG's able to come out on top. They actually look a lot better in both games than FPX does. A lot of the aggressive plays FPX wants to make don't work in the early game, and they don't really have a great way to play from behind, and this kind of does spotlight some of the things I was concerned about. I had been moving FPX slowly up through my power rankings. You know, they started at like 13, they moved to like 7, and then it's like, okay, well, now they're number 6, and now they're number 5, and now they're number 4, because everybody else around them just can't seem to find any sort of consistency. But there are some limitations towards the playstyle that FPX offers, and I think we saw some of them here. For RNG, though, at least they were able to capitalize on those limitations. That's not something that's particularly normal for a team of this caliber. Like, it's very funny how it fluctuates back and forth between good games and good performances and bad performances from some of these players, but I think for the most part, you're happy with what you saw here. Wei is going to get Player of the Series. He got Dud of the Series earlier this week in their loss. Player of the Series here in their win. It's a very interesting conversation, in my opinion, because Wei is such a legacy player for RNG. He's been a part of this roster for a long time. A lot of people associate a lot of good teams with him. He's not played particularly well over the past year and a half, at least not consistently at all. He'll have good games here or there, but, from a game-to-game, situation, he's really not generating as many leads as a lot of the other junglers in the league. He's been average to below average in terms of the performances that he's put out over the past year and a half, but you put him up against, Milky Way, who he's trained and practiced with a lot, and, you give him an opportunity to just kind of establish a lot of that pressure, take away a lot of that pressure in the early game from FPX. He knows exactly how to beat a player like this, and he goes out and he does it. He executes on it. He looks really good in it. So credit to Wei. I don't think this changes my opinion of him too much, but at least he knew what to do, and he executed on it in this series. LWX and Ming were also definitely the better bot lane here, which I definitely did not expect. Life has been on an absolute roll for FPX over the last couple of weeks. He has been an all-pro caliber support, quite frankly. He has been like prime Gen G Life for FPX here, which I think has been a really big positive, but I guess somewhere along the lines, the RNG bot lane is just kind of the streak killer, the momentum killer, because LWX and Ming, having, started to figure out how to play together, having gained at least a little bit of confidence over the past couple of weeks, actually have a great series here. LWX gets super fed on the Varus against his former legacy team, and Ming was phenomenal on the Rakan in game number 1. That's what I want to see out of Ming. I don't want to see any more Ashe. I don't want to see any more Milio. It's just not what Ming does. Put him on Rakan, let him go out there and play make, and just kind of build around that, capitalize on the plays that he is able to make. That's what I think RNG would be able to do at a higher level, but really nice from the bot lane. Tong Yuan went deathless. Breathe had 10 kills across this series. There was a lot of positives for RNG and a lot of negatives for FPX. A lot of concerns in terms of this team is very aggressive and they're going to go for 50-50s. What happens when those don't work? What happens when you're not just able to outskill your opponents? You've been able to rely on Dectum, at least to an extent, to be able to win mid-game skirmishes and keep your team in games because of how good Life has been able to set things up for him. However, that's not always going to work when you're playing against a team that just outplays your bot lane. Where do you win here? Because Milky Way didn't exactly have any pressure in this series. He is kind of the classic example of a player who is going to take a lot of risks, who's going to put himself in bad positions in order to try to outplay his opponents. Think a player like Bo over in the LEC that I've constantly compared him to. Pretty funny that, the FPX connection there between them, but he's going to often be out of position, but he's able to make that work with his playstyle. But what happens when he's not able to make that work? What happens when the enemy jungler knows what he's going to do and is able to just kind of take him out of the game? Okay, well, where else does FPX go? Well, Dectum and Life have been able to carry games for this team this year, specifically Life based off the plays he's been able to create and generally the damage he's been able to output. Well, he didn't have a particularly good series. They kind of threw away game 1 picking Senna Ornn, which I've talked about on this channel. I think is like one of the biggest traps in the entire game. I think Senna plus FunPlus. Anything that isn't Tom Kench is incredibly weak right now in comparison to other AD carries, and they saw that in game 1. And it's not like Zeri Blitz is the lane that's inspiring the most amount of confidence from you coming in game number 2. It just didn't work out. The draft kind of let them down. Kerr, Zhao Lao, who they've not been good enough to win games. For a team like FPX, they've been good enough to be carried by the rest of this team, but they've not exactly had great years. FPX's playstyle restrictions and limitations, I think, are being shown off in a series like this, and unfortunately, it costs them a win. Now, is it going to cost them too much? No, they're at 10-5. They've already qualified for the playoffs. They're in a relatively decent spot, but this team doesn't just want to be good, they want to be great. This is a team that I think has expectations of maybe even making top 4, being in the consideration for that argument, and if that's going to be the case, they simply need to be better in series like this against RNG, where you can't really afford to be dropping games to a team that's as, inconsistent, that's the word, I don't know what I'm doing, as RNG is. So, rough loss for FPX, good win for RNG. It's not going to matter. They're already out of the playoffs. There's not a lot that they can do. However, it does build some confidence. It's going to be interesting to see what happens going into next split. I don't know what the rules are around that loan for Milky Way, but Way outplaying him certainly makes that conversation more interesting, and at least this team is showing some signs of life that they just didn't have earlier in the year. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5 here, and another good one. Thunder Talk Gaming taking on Top Esports. Top is going to get the job done relatively easily. I say relatively because, honestly, if it weren't for Tion and Jackie playing out of their minds, this probably wouldn't have been as close of as easy of a series, I should say. It probably would have been closer for Thunder Talk, but Tion and Jackie were so clearly the two best players on the Rift in both of these games that it just ended up not even really being a problem for TES. Tion and Jackie have been awesome across this split. Of course, 369, Cream, Mako, they've been very good. Mako and 369 have been, in my opinion, the stars of this team, but Tion has very much creeped his way into that conversation by being super consistent on a game-to-game basis. I'm a big fan of Tion, which is kind of funny considering how this channel started out with me kind of pushing back on his hype in favor of his mid laner Knight, because I thought Knight was doing a lot more of the heavy lifting than people were giving him credit for. Tion, not necessarily the carry in that same kind of way when he won his MVP in 2022. However, now that public opinion has kind of shifted on Tion, now that it's gotten a little bit more negative because people have kind of swung too far in the other direction, I feel like I've become a big Tion defender on this channel, talking about just how good he is, how he's clearly a top 4 to 5 jungler in the LPL at his absolute worst. Like, at his best, he's clearly top 3, and it's really not close, but at his worst, he'll have games where he's closer to 4 or 5, but he's still been very consistent for this team, which you have to be excited about. His team fighting in the back half of game 2 on the Jax was essential. His Xin Zhao game in game 1 was still pretty solid, but this really is mostly for that second game on the Jax where I thought he played incredibly well. But you do got to give another big shout out to Jackie Love. I actually haven't said his name a lot over the course of this year, even though I've talked about this bot lane at length. I think they're the second best bot lane in the LPL, only behind Elk and On at the current moment in terms of how they've been able to perform in the isolated 2v2. However, it's mostly been Mako. I think Mako's gotten a lot of the credit for the good plays that this team has made. Rightfully so, Mako has been phenomenal, but Mako didn't exactly play great, especially on the Nami in game 2 where he really wasn't doing anything. A lot of it was up to Jackie Love to really kind of create his own advantages and to express his own dominance. He got super fed on the Draven, was able to snowball that game out of control in game 1, and was very useful down the stretch in some of the final team fights on Lucian. He is one of the best Lucian players in the world, and people tend to forget that because he doesn't play that champion nearly as often as some other people, but he was great here. 369 and Cream were fine. Cream actually had some pretty major problems in the UCal matchup. I think UCal is just the better mid laner of these two, and so I'm not entirely surprised to see Cream not necessarily win the 1v1 or survive, but he was playing Karma. I'm not going to try and sit here and, say that Cream is like mega outclassed, but he was definitely the worst of the two mid laners. 369, honestly, I expected to see more out of him. When it came to some of the active plays, he really wasn't doing anything for a lot of these games, but luckily Tion, Jackie Love, they were both really good and able to win the game for TES. For Thunder Talk, again, this would have been a really big one to win. Now sitting at 6-9, it's going to take an absolute miracle for you to get into playoffs. You didn't exactly go into the series expecting to walk out of this with a win, but you could have been hopeful, you could have been excited, and it just kind of, it's a little bit of a damper to lose this one, and I definitely think that it's not exactly the most exciting way for things to go out, but they were fine. Generally, I think it could have been worse for Thunder Talk in this series. Done of the series is going to go to Hoya. I've been pretty critical of Hoya. He's been one of the worst top laners in the league. He's had good games here and there, which is something that I don't say about some of the other really bad top laners like Decade that are kind of around him in skill level, or even Harry over for anyone's Legend that I think are around him in skill level, but his bad games are just as bad, if not worse, than anybody else in the entire league in his position. So this is what we got here. Basically nothing coming out of him in the top lane. Beishwan and Yukao were actually both relatively good here. Beishwan was actually able to to really dominate some of these fights, and this was one of his more complete performances as an actual damage carry, which he just has not been doing as a pro ever since coming up here to Thunder Talk, but a lot of that was capitalizing on mid lane pressure that UCal was able to generate. Still, jungle mid being a positive is at least something, but bot lane definitely regressed a little bit more back to the mean tier 1 XN and JoJo, just not nearly on the level of Jackie Love and Mako, and they were never really in the same zone. Game 1 was a disaster. The Aphelios Renata absolutely did not work out at all, but for Thunder Talk, you are disappointed in the loss, but not entirely surprised. At 6-9, you're not exactly expecting to get into the playoffs. I don't know if you're officially eliminated. If you are, it's certainly close, but Top Esports, one of the best teams in the league. If this is how you go out, this is how you go out. And then for TES, Tiana and Jackie Love, baby, that is the success point in this series. And then, 369 and Mako have been stars. This can still be one of the scarier teams in the LPL. We've seen this team live up to expectations before. We've also seen them let down expectations before. If this team can make the finals, they could do anything in a best of 5. I truly believe they can beat anybody in the world in a best of 5 if things go entirely right for them. But their flaws are still a little bit more apparent, even more so than the top 2. Then moving on to our third series of day number 5, and it's another upset. And of course, it's the team that you would most expect an upset from, JD Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, and Weibo still owns JDG. I mean, this was a conversation that we had a lot last year when JDG was essentially unbeatable, not only in the regular season, but just generally up until they faced T1 at Worlds. They were untouchable. They were the best team in the world, and everybody agreed on it. They dominated MSI. They kind of ran through the group stage like they just looked fantastic in every facet, but they couldn't quite get over Weibo at any point in the regular season. They were their kryptonite in 2023. Well, it seems that it's carried over into 2024 with another big Weibo win in this one. It doesn't really affect JDG. They're already in a really good position to get a top 2 seed, but this really affects Weibo Gaming, who moves now to 7-8. If they would have lost, they would have moved to 6-9 alongside Thunder Talk. That really would have made things a lot more interesting in terms of the playoff outcomes, but at 7-8, you're actually in a really good spot for Weibo now to make the playoffs, so long as AL continues their cold streak. That's kind of a reliant thing that they are reliant on, but this was a super important win. If they didn't get this, they actually would have been in a very bad spot in terms of the playoff outcomes, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series, pretty obviously for me, is going to go to Xiao Hao. I say pretty obviously, but him and Xiao Hu were both incredible here. The jungle mid duo of Weibo Gaming really was the part of the team that pushed them forward and the part of the team that gapped the enemy more so than anything else. I think that was a really important thing to see. This team has been messing around with taking Xiao Hao out of the lineup throughout the regular season, and I just think that that is an abysmal decision. Not only do I think that you don't really have a player that's going to be on the same level as Xiao Hao, but you're messing with the chemistry, you're messing with the formula, you're messing with this team's ability to get their communication down, and I think that's just generally going to be a negative for them overall, especially when they're really trying to find something down the stretch of this split. You can see what happens here when you have Xiao Hao performing really well on a champion like Poppy. You have Xiao Hu really just outclassing his opponent in Yagao in this series, and, Weibo really being able to step up and just kind of play through them. Everything becomes easier. ZDZ in the top lane doesn't have nearly as much of a responsibility to absorb pressure because pressure can't really be put on the top side of the map without losing a ton elsewhere. Light and Crisp kind of get to just isolate a 2v2 and they get to skirmish in the mid to late game, and that's their strength as a duo, specifically for Light as an AD carry who's kind of safe but is very consistent. When you have this jungle mid kind of working and clicking, you can see how this could be one of the scarier teams in the league. You could see how this could end up working out in Weibo's favor at a super high level. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to see that every game, but at least we know that Xiao Hao looking good here on Poppy, Xiao Hu looking amazing here. It's definitely doable. Xiao Hu's a really funny player because I think he's had a lot more good games this split than people give him credit for. You're still going to hear about a lot of the negative traits, and I do think still this is one of his weaker splits of all time, but you're still going to have great games out of him, and he dominated on Talia here, his signature pick, obviously, but Yagao was not a pushover. He was a bit in this series, but, Xiao Hu really kind of just purely dominated him in terms of the macro, in terms of the laning. It was a great performance out of this jungle mid duo, and I think it elevated Weibo above a team like JDG, but for JDG, this was just kind of a bad series across the board, and I'm not worried fully, but I am a little bit concerned in terms of how this team is playing right now. There have been kind of lingering concerns that we've had over the course of this split up until this point that have not necessarily been resolved. We talked about it earlier, Ruler and Missing certainly not playing the best league they've ever played, and, Yagao's just kind of been there. Sheer is certainly a question mark, but Kanavi's been really good. He's been really consistent, and Yagao, for the most part, is a big reason why that is the case, and Sheer has been on a hot streak, which is why it's more so will the wheels fall off? But they kind of fell off in this series, and it's not just Sheer, it was everybody. Yagao is a pretty clear dud of the series here, a miserable performance coming in from him down the stretcher on the Ahri. We've seen people dominate on that champion. We've seen people completely run it on that champion. And Yao just did not look like he was able to keep up with Xiaohu. This is one of the weakest series that I've seen him play as an individual player. His laning was atrocious, and he just really was not able to stay even remotely relevant in any of these games. Sheer was also just completely outclassed. Not that ZDZ was destroying him in lane, but he just really couldn't do anything if he wasn't getting as many resources as he had been getting in previous series. They still need to kind of baby him a bit as somebody who's not particularly used to playing in pro. And when the rest of the team loses, he's going to go into these fights and he's not going to really accomplish anything. And that's a bit of a problem. Kanavi was entirely out-jungled by Xiaohu, specifically in that second game on Vi. I think Vi is a champion that's kind of been phased out of the meta for a pretty consistent reason. I get that there's point-and-click lockdown, but she doesn't really do much else, especially in comparison to champions like Xin Zhao. And so when you pull it out here in game 2 against a Poppy, really difficult to end up playing that, and he got punished for that. And Ruler and Missing, while they weren't the problem in this series by any means, they certainly weren't the solution. They weren't winning fights in the mid-game 2v2 like they were last year, even when topside was not necessarily the most consistent for JDG. So yeah, there are real concerns. Is this team going to be a team that competes for the title? You sure would hope so. You sure would hope that they're locked into the top 2, but performances like this really show that this is not the team that they were in 2023, that they have made concessions in terms of their roster, and that, you know, those might end up coming back to bite them if things end up going wrong. But for Weibo Gaming, great win, super important one for your playoff hopes. This puts you in a much better position. You wouldn't have been out if you would have lost this, but you would have been pretty darn close if you had lost this, and so pretty important win. If Xiaohu and Xiaohu, if the Xiaos can really step up and continue to play, you know, synergistically at a high level, you know, Crisp is a player that I really like. I think Light's a very consistent carry. You know, there's potential for this team to continue to do damage once they get into the playoffs, but inconsistency is always going to be something with this roster. And that's going to bring us to day number 6, our first of the 2 weekend days here. When we kicked it off, 2 playoff teams going head-to-head. OMG taking on Invictus Gaming, and OMG picks up the 2-0 series win. We actually got Angel back in the lineup a lot quicker than I was expecting here. Linfeng, you know, tried his best to stay relevant in their previous series. Obviously not quite as easy in some series as in others. Didn't exactly get the easiest draw or pick of the litter in that instance, but Angel's back here. He's playing against Invictus, and this team started to roll around him again. It's really interesting. Abel, by the way, was also back in this series. Both Abel and Angel were in the starting lineup. This is the lineup they had been playing for most of the year, and so not entirely shocked to see it here, but Invictus losing and going on this big losing streak is certainly concerning, mostly because this is almost exactly, again, what happened in 2023, is this team started off incredibly hot. They looked really good, and then they kind of got figured out, if you will. Some of the players started to fall off in terms of individual takeover performances, and the general level of the team just couldn't keep up with some of the rest of the teams that were around them in the standings at the time. Something similar is happening right now, which makes it even more of a head-scratching decision, in my opinion, to not change members. I know we talked about it in the middle of the season. The big question with Invictus was, are they succeeding because of their pre-existing chemistry, or are they succeeding because these players have evolved and because they've gotten better and because they have a play style that they can work with? And unfortunately, right now, it's looking like the former rather than the latter, which is definitely not ideal for them. But for OMG, player of the series, it's going to go to Angel. And, you know, we can talk about Zhao Feng being really great in this series, and we will in just a second. He was phenomenal, specifically on the Kindred in game number 2. That's a champion that obviously a lot of these LPL junglers are very comfortable on, but the difference between how this team plays, between just the macro, the decision-making, just the general vibe of how the team plays with Angel versus without Angel is, it's entirely different. It's completely stark, the contrast between, you know, Angel and no Angel in terms of OMG, and it just goes to show you how well he's been playing across this split. Not that Zhao Feng was bad at all in this series, because he was really, really good, but we saw the one series that he played without Angel in the mid lane, and he really lost a lot in the early game. Couldn't get going, was given opportunities and just had nowhere to go with them, which was definitely at least a bit frustrating. Now you have a mid laner that's going to dominate on Talia and move around the map and create a lot of these macro advantages. You have a mid laner who can play Hui and can be super useful at setting up a lot of the things that the Kindred wants to take advantage of. Your job as a jungler, and really as everybody on this team, becomes significantly easier when you have a mid laner that's just winning, that just is really good at the game. And Angel, I think at this point, has really proven himself to be one of the better mid laners in the LPL. He's right up there. You know, I would put him in a similar category to someone like Yukao or Shanks kind of a player that's going to be on the borderline of being like a top 5, top 6, you know, maybe like Cream or, you know, Fofo. Like, those are the players that are going to be in that conversation. But Angel definitely, I think, has earned his way into that conversation, if not just being at the top of it with how he has played. Xiaofeng obviously still had to take over. This was a pretty big jungle gap in this series. The Canyon was pretty large here, as he really just dominated a lot of the pressure of this game, was getting all of the objectives, was getting his laners ahead. Just a great series overall from Xiaofeng. Cube went deathless, playing into a substitute top laner here for IG, and Abel and PP God were generally fine. Abel, you know, continuing to play some of his more signature champions. The Smolder is slowly starting to get integrated into what OMG want to do, but Tristana is definitely more of an Abel pick, and PP God was actually really good in this series, definitely better than his counterpart, and so, you know, it's a good win for OMG. They've guaranteed playoffs now at 8-8. That's where you want to be. IG obviously had already locked themselves into playoffs with how the results had gone, but this could potentially be an early round playoff matchup that we could see previewed here, and that's big for OMG. But for IG, again, there's real concerns about the deterioration of how this team has gone over the past couple of weeks. You Should Know Me is out, Wen is in. This is a very interesting decision to me, because I do think You Should Know Me has taken some strides, some developmental steps over the course of 2024, but I understand that his weaknesses are still very apparent. You're taking him out because he's so volatile, because he's going to pick things like Camille, and he's going to try to 1v1 you in lane, and if it doesn't work, he's just not going to win. You put someone like Wen in, who's a lot more of that weak side top laner, not necessarily going to get a lot of the resources. You're just going to try to rely on him to be more consistent from a game-to-game basis. I understand the idea behind it, and Wen was not the problem in this series, but he's certainly not going to be the solution to this team's problems. Leon is going to get dead of the series. Really does feel like, you know, when he joined, obviously this team felt reinvigorated. His aggressive style, I think, added so much to a team that had really been lacking any sort of jungle pressure as a group of 5 with Tianjin in there. So Leon coming in, I think, really helped them out a lot. Unfortunately, Leon has kind of had a pretty I guess, trackable career trajectory. He has pretty consistently been really good in his first couple of games with the team, or first couple of weeks with the team, where he's able to establish a lot of the aggressive pressure, and teams don't take him nearly as seriously. Teams don't have as much time to prepare for him. And then, you know, further and further along, the performances just start to deteriorate. They start to get a little bit worse and worse and worse. And that's kind of what we're seeing once again here on IG, which is definitely frustrating. This was an awful series from Leon. No pressure in either game on the Xin Zhao. If you're going to lose in the jungle matchup, you can't be picking things like Xin into Kindred. You're going to get absolutely roasted in the mid game, and that's exactly what happened to Leon. Cryon was also not good. I thought Wink was also very bad, especially towards the back half of game number 2 on the Tahm Kench. It just didn't feel like IG ever had a chance in this series, and that is frustrating, because this was a team that at times was competing for a top 4 spot, was in the conversation with teams like Ninjas and Pyjamas and WE and FPX, and like they were in the same tier and conversation as a lot of those teams, and it just has not carried over into the back half of the season. They are very similarly to some other teams going into the playoffs or going into the end of the year as cold as possible, which is never a good thing, and they're going to need to figure things out quickly. But for OMG, again, a very nice win. I still don't feel great about this team. They are the definition of mid. They are the definition of a 500 team. They're going to win some. They're going to lose some. I don't expect them to make any sort of deep run or to overachieve. They remind me so much of how Ninjas in Pyjamas last year ended up playing. I think there's obviously some differences in terms of how things are going down, but Angel's influence on this team, I think, is being felt, and as long as he's playing, they're at least going to be competitive in a lot of games. And then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and it's a 7-7 matchup. Two teams sitting at 500 for very different reasons. Team WE taking on LNG Esports, and LNG is going to continue their pseudo hot streak towards the back half of this split with another win here to move them to 8-7, to move WE down to 7-8. Both of these teams kind of moving in opposite directions. LNG obviously starting 2-6, not necessarily looking great, but really starting to get an easier schedule, and we'll talk about this because there seems to be some weird perception that I really want to talk about when it comes to LNG, that I think Reddit has just like completely whiffed on this one. Like the ball has gone way past wherever they're trying to hit it and has just gone sailing into the sky. I guess I'll try to course correct the idea, but again, we'll talk about it. WE, they are a team that is starting to really get exposed for some of the flaws that they have. They're starting to get exploited for their weaknesses as a team. They have a very clear play style, and I think teams are really ready for them now. And now they're not able to capitalize and generate the same kind of leads that they were able to generate earlier on in the season. And it's really becoming a bit of a problem for them because they don't have the same kind of upside, like theoretical upside, as maybe some of the other teams that are around them, like LNG, in the standings. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For LNG, I'm quickly going to touch upon this. I don't really want to talk about this a lot because if you follow this channel, then you are probably already in the camp that Tarzan is underrated and Scout is not a prop. Like, Scout's underperformances this year are more indicative of a bigger problem, and also Weiwei isn't necessarily the problem on this team just because he doesn't necessarily fit the style that the rest of these players like to play. All of those things can be true. None of the players can be a problem. It can all just be fit, right? It can all be situation. It can all be circumstance. But the entire narrative so far this split has been getting rid of Tarzan and bringing in Weiwei has cost LNG being a top team. Like, it has turned them into a bottom team or a bad team or whatever, yada, 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 whatever people want to say. And I already disagreed with that because, again, I think it was more fit. I agree with it in the concept of, like, I think if you kept Tarzan here, you probably have a better split because Tarzan, from a playstyle perspective, just fits how the rest of these players want to play a little bit cleaner. He's more of a supportive jungler. Weiwei's much more of a carry-oriented jungler. One's going to skirmish a lot in the early game. The other plays a lot more to give up resources to his laners to allow them to win team fights. It's a very different style of game depending on which jungler you have in, and I think the rest of this team values late game team fighting just a bit more than they do early game skirmishes, which is why I think it's looked worse with Weiwei. But now we are kind of flipping the opposite way. LNG has replaced their strategic coach. They have brought in a new one, as I talked about earlier this week, and they've gone on a pretty big win streak because of it. But let's talk about why correlation does not equal causation in terms of analysis, why it is absurd to look at bringing in a strategic coach, not saying that he hasn't helped at all, but to say that that is the only reason this team has gotten better, and to look at this winning streak and say that this wouldn't have happened if they had kept things the same. So I went about actively writing down what happened throughout this split for LNG, why I think they are doing better now. So let's go ahead and talk about just their schedule, because this is obviously the most clear indicator that this conversation just doesn't need to happen, that this strategic coach or, a don't blame the jungler conversation doesn't need to happen, that it is irrelevant. Let's look at their first 8 games. Let's look at who they played. Okay, so they played Thunder Talk in their first series and lost. That is their worst loss pretty clearly of the year. Well, we'll get into that. But Thunder Talk, then they played OMG and won. Then they played Weibo Gaming and won, which are 2 decent wins. But then they played JD Gaming, Bilibili Gaming, FunPlus Phoenix, Top Esports, Ninjas in Pyjamas. Those are the best teams in the league. So now you're 2-6, and you've played, let's see, BLG at 1, JDG at 2, TES at 3, FPX and NIP are 4 and 5. You've played the 5 best teams in the league, and you've lost to those 5. That's 5 of your 6 losses, your other one to Thunder Talk. It happens, and you've beaten OMG and Weibo Gaming, 2 teams that look like they could be playoff teams as well. So honestly, you're sitting at 2-6, and everybody's freaking out and crying and talking about how this team is underperforming, and we're trying to figure out, what was the problem? Was Tarzan leaving the problem? Is coaching the problem? Yada, yada, yada. Meanwhile, they're basically at expectation. I mean, maybe you could have thought they would be a top 3 team, but okay, they're the 6th or the 7th best team in the league, then they're at expectation because they basically only played top 5 teams. Okay, and now they go on this big win streak. They replace their strategic coach. Okay, well, who are the teams that they're playing in this win streak? Okay, RNG at their absolute worst, Ultra Prime, LGD, who they lost to, Invictus Gaming at the start of their decline, Edward Gaming, Anyone's Legend, and now a WE team that's on the downturn as well. Do we not see the problem with just trying to say that it's a personnel decision? We saw this coming. They played every single tough team at the beginning of their split, and now they've played every single bottom team in this win streak, and it happens. I'm not trying to sit here and say that, they haven't made improvements or that strategies haven't changed. I think they're playing less for Weiwei and more for Scout with the new strategic coach. I think bringing Hong back into the lineup has really helped a lot. There are changes that they've made that have made this team better, but trying to sit here and I see so many arguments online about being I don't want to hear that Tarzan should be scapegoated ever again. I don't want to hear any Tarzan apologists ever again, because now they're winning and Weiwei's in the lineup. Yeah, they're beating RNG, Ultra Prime, Edward Gaming, and Anyone's Legend. Yeah, I would hope they're winning. They lost to LGD still in this win, or in this stretch with the new strategic coach. This is not a new, reinvigorated team. This is a 6th or the 7th best team in the league performing up to expectation, and that still is an underperformance for maybe where you would look at this roster on paper. And so I hope that clarifies some of my thoughts on this issue, that this is not a binary issue of Tarzan, we're overcomplicating this, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We are trying to find things to suit our personal biases. If you dislike Tarzan and criticized him last year, then you need to find a reason to justify that by saying, oh yeah, see, Tarzan wouldn't have been the solution because they got a new strategic coach and started winning. When obviously they would have won no matter what against Ultra Prime and Edward Gaming and these other teams that everybody has been able to beat. But I don't want to linger on this too long. I just really wanted to make this point because I actually feel like it's a very important point to make in terms of analysis, in terms of how we as fans view these games, because it seems that we will try to find anything that will either back up the information or the actions that we have previously posted or previously thought, or alternatively, we are looking for the most minute of things to look at as causation for why a team is either moving in a positive or negative direction. Things are rarely so black and white, and obviously not everybody there has taken courses and classes on, the theory behind analysis, but like, it shouldn't take that to know that obviously there's more at play here than just switching up a strategic coach, and there's more at play than getting rid of Tarzan and bringing in Weiwei. There is more at play than just that. There are a lot of things going wrong with this team, and it doesn't make any of these players bad players. So that's my aside. We'll talk quickly about this series because I wanted to spend most of this section just kind of talking about that, but Scout was really good. He's going to get player of the series here. Ever since this team has started moving into giving him more resources again, surprise, surprise, he's doing well. He's back in a role that is very familiar to him from what he played last year. He was really struggling being more of a facilitative mid laner that needed to be strong in the early game so that his jungler could skirmish, because that's how Weiwei has always played, and I think that was the idea behind bringing Weiwei in, is trying to get more aggressive in the early game to keep up with other aggressive teams. It just isn't the way Scout plays, and he really struggled in that role. I think now that he's more comfortable at being able to receive resources and being more of a teamfight carry rather than a playmaker in the mid game for this team, I think that is getting him back into form. Gala and Hong are phenomenal as a duo. They are quickly creeping up into being one of the top, best bot lanes in the LPL once again. They have been sensational ever since Hong came back in. Weiwei was solid, maybe not dominant, but certainly good, and Zika was good as well. Actually received a lot of pressure on the top side and was able to survive and still be super useful in the late game. So LNG looked good, and WE, like I said, they've kind of been figured out. The identity behind this team, I think, has been solidified at this point. This bot lane is just not good. Awandi's going to get done of the series. Where is he going? Truly, I'm starting to lose my mind. Obviously, Prince isn't playing well, and I'm not trying to sit here and say that Prince is entirely faultless, because he didn't play great in this series either. But dude, when you're a Maokai and you're in lane for maybe 3 levels, what are we doing? I don't understand. He is addicted to leaving Prince alone and to letting his AD carry die. It is truly baffling how WE is playing this. I don't know if Awandi just hates Prince, if there's some genuine animosity between it, because it kind of feels like it on the Rift, or if he's trying to protest stay to come back into this lineup. But whatever is happening, these two just will not play together in any sort of discernible way, and it's destroying this team, because WE likes to put a lot of pressure in the top lane, but what happens when the enemy picks Ornn in game number 2 and just sits him top, and yeah, you can gank him, but you're not going to shut him down, and yeah, you're getting gold on your jungle rumble, and what does it really matter? Fofo's required to carry the game now on Tristana, and he's not that kind of player, and so you end up just losing. Again, it's a very easy playstyle to end up stopping. I still think they're going to be very adept at beating teams that they can just outskill, because that's kind of the way that this lineup ends up going, but against teams that actually do have a game plan and a style and very high mechanics, they're just going to get outscaled in a lot of these instances because of game plan. And so, WE is going to fall down my power rankings, that is for sure. And LNG is going to move up because this team has figured out a thing that works for them. I still don't feel all that differently to them than I did 3 weeks ago, because again, it's not like they've beaten anybody extraordinary outside of WE, but still, 8 and 7's pretty respectable, and this team's probably going to find a middle playoff placement now. Then moving on to our third series of day number 6, and it's going to be the final series of the year for the team in first place. We have Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG goes out on a strong note. They are going to win this 2-0, dominating NIP in this series and ending their split at 15-1, an identical record to what they came out in summer with. Last year, obviously different expectations though. Coming out of summer, basically everybody assumed that they were still the number 2 team. They had lost to JD Gaming, their only loss in the regular season. And even if JDG did stumble a bit more against some other teams, it was always kind of considered JDG 1, Bilibili 2, and they still underperformed in playoffs, only getting 3rd. Obviously, they were interesting at Worlds. They weren't perfect. They lost to Weibo in the semifinals, but semifinals is pretty damn good. I just think people would have expected them to win that series against Weibo, but the expectations are just simply higher this year because of the way this roster is played and the fact that they are, in my opinion, clearly the number 1 team in the LPL at the current moment. They should be favorites to win the LPL trophy here in spring, but let's talk about why. Let's talk about what this team continuously does well. Knight on Ahri. It's as simple as that sometimes. Sometimes it's as simple as taking the best player in the region, the best player on your team, and putting him on the champion that he is the best at 2 games in a row, and just kind of letting him go and win the game. The fact that NIP allowed this not only once, but twice, the fact that Rookie wasn't Maybe we take that away. It's absurd to me. Like, why would you give him this? He just wins every single game that he's on this. I think he's got like a career 81% win rate or something on Ari as a champion. It's something ridiculous. That number could be wrong, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of that. You just can't give him Ari. Like, you just can't do it, dude. This guy is ridiculous. He was building Medjais in game 2. He was that far ahead. He was just absolutely eviscerating everything NIP wanted to do and just was the better player in this series by a considerable margin. On was fantastic on Nami, on Lulu, was actually very active on the map, was consistently helping in a lot of the skirmishes, which I do think actually propelled BLG forward a bit, but Elk continues to be really good. He's playing Lucian, he's playing Zeri, he's getting no resources from his jungler, and yet he's still dominating lane phase, and Fodic's a good player. Fodic's had a very good split, and is looking really good, and Elk just made him look like an absolute child in this performance on Zeri in game number 2. Great stuff. June was pretty solid here. Bin really got to start taking over on the Aatrox. This top lane matchup did not stay close, really, at all. These are two players that I both like, but man, Bin absolutely obliterated Shanji in the 1v1 here. This was just a desecration by Bilibili, and a great way for them to end their split. At 15-1, they are looking incredibly dominant. Like I said earlier, they have to be the favorites going into the playoffs, but for Ninjas in Pyjamas, you would have wished maybe this series was a bit closer. You're not all that perturbed, I think, about losing to BLG because they are the best team in the region, and everybody's lost to BLG with the exception of that one random Invictus Gaming series that we always get in the middle of a year, but maybe you could have hoped to lose a little bit more gracefully. I think that probably would have been good. Done of the series is actually kind of hard because Shanji got obliterated on the top side of this map, even playing one of his signature champions. In Rumble, you had someone like Aki, who was just entirely useless on the Poppy in game 2. One of the most inactive jungle performances I've seen, but I'm going to give it to Rookie in the mid lane. I mean, to Ego, allow Ari in both games, and then pick LeBlanc and get absolutely gapped in the mid lane matchup. It's not ideal for a player that I think has been maybe the second best mid laner in the entire region so far this split. I mean, Knight has, in my opinion, clearly been the best mid laner in the LPL and is the leading candidate for MVP, and, I'm not going to spoil anything. We're going to be doing awards, but, Knight is certainly going to be in that conversation for me, but Rookie, I mean, he's been awesome for this team. He's been very stable, very consistent. He's not immune to bad games, but they're much more few and far between than they were in previous years, but, I mean, this Karma, this LeBlanc, he just was never in any of these games, and to allow someone like Knight to be able to get everything that he wants in both of these games, it's just not great. Fodic and Jewel, like I said earlier, got completely gapped, mostly by Elk, because On was honestly everywhere on the map, except in the bot lane, and Elk really still did demolish them, but, again, it was just Ninjas in Pyjamas losing around the Rift, losing around the map. Nowhere was strong for them. 10-5 is fine for now. Hopefully they can end off their split in a good way with a potential win in their 16th game to get them to 11-5. I think that would be fine, but there are real questions about whether or not this team is even remotely competitive. But Bilibili, can anyone be competitive with them? That's the question at this point. It's not, who's going to be competitive with BLG? Can anyone be competitive with BLG? Right now, it's a really, really hard sell to say that this is not the best team in the world. It really is them versus Gen G for that argument, whoever you think is currently playing better League of Legends, but it's really hard not to take Bilibili in that argument with just how much they are demolishing the teams that they play against. They are more aggressive, they are more mechanically intensive, and they've got maybe the best player in the world right now in Knight. It's either him or Chovy in terms of the individual performances that have been put out, but Elk has been amazing, Bin has been amazing, June and On have been amazing. These are all pro caliber players, and Bilibili deserves all the praise that they are getting. And that's going to bring us to our 7th and final day of action here in the LPL in week number 8. Again, thank you so much for sticking around this long. If you are still here, I always appreciate those of you who watch the entire video, but it's time to move on to our 7th and final day, and we kick it off with a matchup of 4 and 10 teams out of the playoffs. Rare Atom taking on LGD Gaming, and LGD is going to pick up the win here. Some might see this as an upset, but I do not. This is expected in terms of how these two teams have performed. So far this split, LGD has been above Rare Atom in terms of my power rankings, and this really does nothing to kind of dissuade those thoughts and dissuade that feeling. They are definitely the better of these two teams. They have a lot more upside, and honestly, they did a lot of really good things here. First of all, they drafted very well for their individual players. We always talk about how some players on LGD are a little bit more, champion dependent. They have smaller champion pools than maybe your average team of a different style would, and that's why I think you have such variable performances from a team like them, where you're going to have good games, you're going to have bad games, but they can't necessarily close series because, for the most part, they are pretty reliant reliant on being able to get the things they're comfortable with. However, when they do get them, boy, do they pop off. Haichao got his Talia here, which I think is obviously big. Meteor got to play 2 games of Graves, which is his signature champion, maybe alongside the Kindred. And then Bertle got to play some tanks on the top side where he could just kind of run around and do his own thing. These are all big positives for this team, but I think the really big takeaway for me for LGD in this one is my player of the series. And my 2 player of the series, I'm not giving them to both. My player of the series is Xiaoya in the AD carry role. He's back in here for Kepler. They clearly just wanted to see what they had with both. I think Xiaoya looked really, really good in this series, and he got to play one of his signature picks in the Draven in game number 1, and man, did he pop off. He absolutely obliterated Rare Adam on Draven, and then it was time for his support, his lane mate in Jinzhao, to have a really good game number 2 on the Alistair. You know, we see good games from Jinzhao every so often. I always talk about this. It's kind of interesting to talk about because it's going to sound very weird because these players have very different reputations in terms of how they play the game, but Jinzhao is kind of like the support and Chinese version of Umti. Like, I know that's a very weird thing to say, but in the sense of you can reliably count on them having 4, 5, 6 really awesome games a split, and then like 18 really bad ones. Like, that's just kind of what you have to live with, is you have to put up with the fact that for the most part, they're going to be negatives towards their team. For the most part, they aren't going to be very good, but every so often, you're going to get these really good performances out of them when they're able to be on comfort when the rest of the team is winning. That's what Jinzhao was in game number 2. So Xiaoya, Jinzhao, I thought both played really well. But again, shout out to the rest of the team. Meteor went 12-0-14 on 2 games of Graves. It's really nice to see him get a signature champion. I'm shocked they didn't index more into this throughout the season. I know it was banned a lot, but when it wasn't, they still were favoring a lot of tanks, which I just do not think plays towards what LGD want to do. Bertle went deathless on the top side here, 17 assists through this series. Haichao was pretty solid. You know, generally they were just a better team by a pretty large margin in this one, and it's not entirely surprising to me. But for RA on the other side, for Rare Adam, this is just a bad team. And it's not bad in the way that you would necessarily have expected after their horrendous start to the year. You know, Vikla was obviously such a nuisance and a problem for them at the beginning of the year because he just was not playing well, was one of the worst players in the LPL through the first couple of weeks, but he really has been the one to stabilize, and it's been everybody else in this team that's really struggled. Now, Xiaoshu, I think, is still a good player, but didn't really get to do anything this series. Bertle was definitely in control of the laning phase and just kind of shut everything down, but it's everything else. Like, Neyu has been a disaster, maybe the worst player on this team, but he's got stiff competition with Zora, the support here, who I'm just so out on. He's been given 3 full seasons, not full seasons, he's been given 3 seasons to really figure something out here at the LPL level, and it's just never gotten better, and you could argue that it's gotten worse. He was bad on RA to start, he was fine and then bad on AL as the season continued to go along, and now he's bad again here on RA, and I just don't know how much more patience you have to have with a player of his caliber. I know that there is this perceived upside, but I've just never seen it, and he continues to really underperform in basically any role he's asked to do, whether that be as an engager or as an enchanter. It doesn't really matter. He's never really performed at a particularly good level at the LPL, and it's, you know, maybe you can chalk it up to bad AD carries, right? Like, he got to train with iBoy, and iBoy was horrendous down the stretch of his career. Now he has to play with Assume, who's one of the weaker ADCs in the league, but like, what else do you really want to see from him at this point? We have seen all that there is to see, and it's not good. Assume is also not particularly good. I don't think he's awful. He's not the kind of player that's going to ruin or run down games for you, but he's also just not generating any leads or advantages. Like, his laning is really bad. He doesn't do anything in team fights. He's just a complete non-factor for this RA team. And even if I do like Xiaoshu, and I think that he's the best player on this team, Neyu has been a major disappointment. Vikla just is super inconsistent. Even if he has good games and sometimes doesn't lose nearly that bad, he's not always winning in terms of his laning phases. He's not like that kind of player, and so, you know, for Rare Adam, they're just not a great team right now. I expect changes moving into summer. And then for LGD, you know, really happy to see them actually pick up some consistent wins down the stretch here. 5-10 might not seem like a fantastic record, but, you know, considering what they've been in the last couple of years, this is actually a pretty good performance and situation for them. You've got some players that are interesting to move on with. Players like Haichao and Bertle and Xiaoya, I think, are pretty clear locks to keep around in summer. You would hope that Meteor can get back on track now that he's playing less tanks, you know, a style that doesn't necessarily fit him. I think that there are interesting pieces on this team, and maybe with a few tweaks, a little change here and there, I think this could actually be a team that potentially makes a playoff push in summer. Then moving on to the second series of day number 7, and the final 2 ones here are actually going to determine quite a bit, because we're actually going to start getting into the conversation of whether or not the top 2 seeds could end up changing. We've got a matchup between Top Esports and Anyone's Legend, And Top Esports is going to pick up the win. They needed to get this win in order to at least put themselves in the conversation for being able to get a top 2 seed. Obviously, we'll see what happens in the final series of the day here, but with this loss, Anyone's Legend has officially been eliminated from playoff contention, and that is sad. I mean, it's 7-9. This team was 7-4. They've lost their last 5 series in a row, and that's just the death of it. Like, there's no way to come back from that. It's unfortunate that this team got super cold down the stretch, but is it that entirely surprising? There were some good moments and some good performances down the stretch. I think Krakow actually started playing better in the final week that they played here. I think players like Kale were generally really good throughout the entirety of the year, but their stars really weren't able to keep up, and we'll kind of talk about that. For Top Esports, it's a good performance. Maybe you would have wanted to see them win game 1, but 2, 3, they were both pretty good from them. Game 3 in particular was relatively dominant. Never really a lot of concern from them, but player of the series was kind of difficult because I think both of the members on the top side of the map were fantastic. I'm going to give it to 369 because I do think he was a little bit better in his game 2, if you will. Tian was still really good on the Sedge in game 2 and was arguably more important on the Xin in game 3, but I think that game 2 on Renekton was really kind of the game breaker, or the series opener, if you will, for Top Esports. It saved the series for them. His team fighting was phenomenal. 369 is just awesome. He's been the best top laner in the LPL, in my opinion. It's been a pretty interesting conversation to have in terms of performance. I don't know if I would necessarily take him as the #1 top laner because Bin is so good, but they more are like 1A, 1B for me right now. Him and Bin are just that fantastic, and 369 has really been able to go up against everybody this year. He's not always going to be perfect. We've seen him actually lose a couple of games. He lost to Sheer, the rookie jungler for JDG, which obviously wasn't ideal, but outside of that, he's been nearly perfect the entirety of this year, and you've just got to give him a lot of credit for that. Tian has also been very, very good this split. All pro caliber. You know, jungle's a very hard position to choose from. I think there's 4 incredibly valid candidates at the moment as we head into the back half of the split. I don't know if Tian's going to make it or if he's not going to make it, but he certainly has put in performances to deserve an all-pro nod. Was awesome on the Sedge in game 2, was even better on the Xin Zhao in game number 3, where he really was able to completely dictate the tempo, completely change the complexion of that game, and ended off really quickly, even with Krakow playing relatively well. I think Tian's just an amazing player, and to see 369 and Tian both play well here, it's definitely encouraging. Jackie Love, Cream, Mako, maybe they were a little over-aggressive at times, but for the most part, they were also major positives, especially Jackie Love, who I think had a very good week overall. But for Top, really the big win coming out of this series is that you got the series win. You moved to 12-3, which means that JDG in their next series, if they lose it, you guys are tied in terms of record, and that really opens up a lot of possibilities for the end of the split once we get into some of the final games. But for AL, being eliminated here, not ideal. Being able to somehow drop out of the playoffs to bottle it towards the back half here by losing your last 5 series is certainly not an ideal situation to be in, but honestly, they kind of earned it. I moved them down to number 11 in my power rankings. They felt like the weakest of all of the teams. I didn't know if they were actually going to miss playoffs because they had such a gigantic lead on all of these teams that were attempting to catch up to them, but somehow, some way, they ended up doing it. They ended up missing it. And you just have to look at some of the players that really deteriorated as the split went on. Most notably, my dud of the series, Shanks. Shanks was like an all-pro guy for the first half of the split. He was playing out of his mind. He was really pushing AL over the top, and he was the dynamic, direct carry that they could play through. And then all of a sudden in the second half, he completely falls off a cliff. He starts losing isolated 1v1 in lanes. He's not making any sort of action in the mid-game. And all of the positives that kind of came along with Shanks are now gone, and the team is really underperforming because of it, and they didn't really have anybody else that could step up. I've been talking for his entire career that Hope is just not a primary carry option. You could never put Hope on a bad team and expect him to be able to carry that. That's just not who he is. And I love Kale, and I thought Kale actually had a very good year, all things considered, but like, what are you going to do, carry playing Lulu? Like, I get the idea that like you can carry a game on Lulu, but like, come on, he's not going to be able to carry a bad team on Lulu. Krakow was actually really good down the stretch here for this team, and he had good moments, but he had miserably bad moments. When you look at the worst games that AL played, almost all of them were Krakow, and just him running it down, and Harry is just barely an LPL level top laner at this point. He was actually okay generally in this series, but this was one of his better series of the year, and he still got beaten and destroyed by 369 specifically in that second game. So there's really not a lot of positives to take away from this for AL. Hopefully they can figure stuff out and move into the summer split with a little bit more confidence. I don't think they're going to make any roster changes. I think you just need to get Shanks back on track. That really is the difference between you being a playoff team and you not being a playoff team, is having Shanks be Shanks, is getting him to the part where he's comfortable. So we'll see what happens. But for TES, really nice win at 12-3. It's going to be up to the next series to kind of see what ends up happening, but this is a big win for them. And then moving on to our third and final series of the 7th and final day this week. It is a matchup between Edward Gaming and JD Gaming that went in favor of JDG, which puts them at 13-3 to end their regular season as well. That does mean that they have now done everything in their power to keep their top 2 seed in check. It's all going to be up to what happens with Top Esports in the final week, but at 13-3, they've done everything that they could do in this series. 2-0, that's what you needed to see from JD Gaming. So we're going to quickly talk about it. I'm not going to harp on this series too much because it's JDG just absolutely shellacking EDG, who is one of the worst teams in the league, and so there's really not a lot to glean from this, but player of the series is going to go to Kanavi in the jungle. He has been an MVP caliber player this year. I think really it just comes down to personal preference, in my opinion, on who you want to give the MVP to. It's either Knight or it's Kanavi for me. It's one of those two. They have been the 2 best players in the LPL so far in 2024, and I would expect that to continue moving forward. I think that these players have, over a long period of time, proven to both be exceptionally talented. I mean, Knight, obviously, I've gushed about on this channel, but Kanavi was the MVP candidate out of the 2 of them when they were playing together last year, and so really funny to see how they both go their separate ways, and they don't play as a duo anymore in the jungle mid, but yet they are both still playing at such an elite level that they are essentially competing against each other for the most valuable player award, at least in my opinion. I know there are going to be people that want to throw, like, Milky Way into the conversation. I'm sure there's going to be other players that end up appearing on my radar, but for now, those are definitely the top 2. But it wasn't just Kanavi. First of all, he did play great in this series. He was especially good on the Viego in Game 2, where he was able to just get those resets and really take over the game, but it wasn't just Kanavi. Ruler had a very good series. They played 3 series this week, and this was easily the best that this bot lane had at any point. Really, in the first 2, both were kind of concerning to me for different reasons. The first one because they just didn't dominate or really take over in any way against a bot lane they should be beating, and then the second one because they lost, because they really were not the better of the 2 bot lanes, which was definitely also concerning. But Ruler did show up in this one, specifically on the Varus in game number 1. I'm not sure Smolder is exactly what you want to give Ruler. I think you want to give him something that he can actually go out and make proactive plays with in the mid game. That's just kind of what he has always been really good at. I still think he can play Smolder at a high level, and certainly he wasn't bad in game number 2, but I think he was much more of a recipient, and taking the agency out of Ruler's hands is not necessarily something I would want to do in terms of my drafts, but he was good here. Missing was pretty solid. Again, maybe a little over-aggressive with some engages, but was generally good. I think Yagao had a much better bounce-back series against a much easier level of competition, and Sheer did a good job to actually shut down Ale, really the only player who's been able to generate consistent advantages for EDG. So, nice stuff from JD Gaming. Again, don't want to harp on it too much. Kanavi and Ruler looking really good in this team, doing what they should have done in a series like this, and EDG also kind of doing what they should have done in a series like this, which is get destroyed. They are going to end their split as well here at 3-13. Like, obviously, you would have hoped things would have gone a bit better for them this split, but it's a rebuilding year. We never really expected too much from them. Unfortunately, they even underperformed the worst of expectations by being one of the worst teams in the entire league. You can point to multiple different members, but there's at least takeaways from the ending week here that you can move into future splits with. I think 0909 in the mid lane is definitely the direction to go, at least moving forward, unless you're going to go out and spend on a mid laner, which I certainly would not deem out of the realm of possibility. You know, I don't really know what EDG is going to do, but I think going out there and actually spending for high-profile free agents, or just trying to go get players from other teams, I think that that's definitely a possibility for an organization that is certainly not used to being, like, bottom of the standings. But if they are going to continue with the youth, if they just want to use 2024 as a rebuild year to see who they can keep on the roster and build around, I think 0909 is definitely the answer in the mid lane. He was generally fine here against Yagao. Certainly wasn't the problem on the team in the way that Fisher has been. It was the other rookies. Monkey's going to get done of the series. Jungle was a massive gap in this one. There was just no game where he even remotely survived. Game 1 on the Viego, he looked worse. Game 2 on the Xin Zhao, he looked worse, and it's even worse in terms of perception because Kanavi played those 2 champions as well and just won both sides of the matchup. So really not ideal, but, you know, Monkey has been kind of a hit or miss player. Ale was generally fine, but honestly one of the weaker series that he's had in terms of impact. Credit to Sheer on his end, and the Snake and Vampire just got absolutely obliterated. It was pretty apropos for Ruler to bounce back in this matchup, but the Snake really not looking good. Vampire is, if not the worst support, one of the worst supports in the LPL. Not surprised to see this bot lane just not be able to keep up with the ferocity that is JD Gaming, but overall, EDG is just not good. This doesn't exactly, you know, change anything about about what I expect the future to be for EDG, but it's going to be interesting to see what direction they move in for summer, whether they want to make wholesale changes or whether they just want to use this year to potentially continue to try and look at some of these players. I think you've got your answer with players like Fisher and Vampire to an extent, but players like the Snake and Monkey, I think potentially could have more to prove if they are continuing to get shots. It's just going to be interesting to see where things end up going. But for JDG, it's a nice win. You've done everything you can to set yourself up into the best position possible to actually end off this year in one of the top 2 spots. It would not be ideal if you fell to number 3 because obviously you lose that guaranteed like extra life that you would normally get as the 1 or 2 seed. But this team could potentially build some confidence up in the playoffs as well. I imagine they're going to do fine in best ofs. I think this is a good end to the split, even if they haven't necessarily looked perfect up until this point. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL week number 8 overview and analysis video. Of course, up on the screen now, the updated standings. And we do have our 10 playoff teams officially locked in. Our bottom teams have officially been eliminated because there is no way for things to change in terms of series score, in terms of game score. We know the teams that will be finishing in the top 10 with the shortened week in week number 9. And of course, you see that on your left-hand side. We can go over the winners, the risers, the fallers in my personal power rankings. This is a little bit of a spoiler, obviously, for my playoff preview video because some of these teams aren't going to play again in the regular season, but we'll get to that when we get to that, of course. Let's talk about the power rankings and how they've gone up and how they've gone down. 1, 2, 3, they're going to stay the same. They are so clearly ahead of everybody else, in my opinion. Bilibili's the best team in the league, and JD Gaming and Top Esports are behind them in some order. I think JDG right now feels like the better team because I trust them just a little bit more, but if TES wins next week and dominates and ends up taking that number 2 seed, that could make a lot of the difference for a playoff run. Ninjas in Pyjamas is going to jump up to number 4. I don't really trust this team. They got obliterated this week, and so it's not exactly like you're feeling great about them, but I don't know. Who else do you put there? FPX also lost, and they lost in kind of worse fashion, feeling like they've kind of been figured out a bit. LNG starts to rise up. They go up 3 spots to number 6 because they've been playing better, but I still don't trust that they're actually going to turn things around. They've been playing better against bad teams, and so, you know, can I really trust that? I've got OMG moving up to 7. I always talk about they're the definition of mid. They're the definition of a 500 team, and yet I keep moving them up in my power rankings because so many teams feel like they are worse than average at the moment. I've got WE falling down to 8. It again feels like they have been figured out, but almost more so to an extent than like FPX has because they're just not able to execute on basically anything other than the style that they've been playing. And then Invictus, who's on a down streak, goes to 9. Weibo Gaming, who's not been consistent in any form, is still at 10. Like, it's just really hard to try to get a grasp of where these teams are moving into playoffs. I think this is the most variable of any of the regions in terms of power rankings, maybe with the exception of the LEC, where you just never really know who's going to win any given game on any given day. But numbers 4 to 10 in the power rankings in the LPL, like basically any order you want. It really is that simple. The only other change out of the playoffs is that EDG jumps Ultra Prime. They're going to move up to 16. Ultra Prime moves down to 17. Nothing else is going to change. All of these teams are eliminated, and all of them performed, I think, as expected this week. But let me know if you agree or disagree with my power rankings down in the comment section below. Would love to know your feedback on whether or not you would have changed more or less going into this week. But it's time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 8. Player of the week, no shocker to anybody who watched the video. It's going to go to Knight, the mid laner for Bilibili. Right now, he's the pretty clear-cut favorite, in my opinion, for MVP. He truly has been terrific for Bilibili. They're the best team in the league. He is the best player on the best team in the league. They play through him. They play without him. Whenever he gets Ahri, they just straight up win the game. Like, it's crazy how important and how good he is. I know a lot of people, you know, kind of didn't really acknowledge the importance to his team last year. Me kind of being included on that because I do think that he just didn't get the same kind of resources that he had been getting, but I've always been one of the biggest Knight fans in the world. He's been consistently at number 1 or number 2 in terms of my global power rankings, my global player rankings, the entirety of this channel's history. And so, you know, I've always thought Knight was an elite player, and he's getting the chance to show it again. The runners-up, the honorable mentions here for week 8, Tian, the jungler for Top Esports. Top had a very good week, and Tian was the biggest part of that. In my opinion, consistently able to generate leads, and he's been very consistent. That's the word I'd use all split long. And then Fodic, the bot laner for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Like I've been saying all week, maybe the best split of his entire career in terms of individual actual performances in terms of what he is showing without essentially being gift-wrapped opportunities like he was in 2022. This is a very impressive split so far and a very good week for Photic. And then unfortunately, Dud of the Week has to go to somebody. It's going to go to Prince, the bot laner for WE. This team is just not clicking. Prince and Awandi have negative chemistry. They're both playing really bad right now, but, you know, Awandi played well when Stay was in, and so you have to look at Prince as a little bit of a concern here. Now, do I think it's entirely him individually as a player with his mechanics and his decision-making? No, I don't think it's entirely him. I think Awandi is leaving him out on an island to dry, and he's just not, you know, very good at that play style. I think I've never seen a team play so little for bot lane and so much for top lane. Like, Prince is given about as little as any AD carry in the entire league. In fact, I would say he's given by far the least of any AD carry in the entire league, and yet the team is still not finding advantages on the top side of the map now, and that's definitely frustrating. But Prince, because of that, is having bad performances, and because of that, is going to get Dud of the Week. But I would love to know your thoughts and opinions on those two. Prince as Dud of the Week, Knight as Player of the Week in Week 8. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. It really would mean a lot to me if you left a like on this video. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We don't only post about the LPL. Playoffs are kind of rolling around the clock right now. LCK is about to start. You've got NA, both the LCS and the NACL, already rocking and rolling in playoffs, and so a lot of coverage going on. LEC is going to be wrapping up the regular season once again soon, so if you want kind of comprehensive overviews of everything going on in LoL Esports right before MSI with all of the teams that are going to have the chance to qualify for MSI, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.